My name is Reagan, and I'm going to be reading from Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Moby-Dick. Chapter 1. New Memes. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, sometime or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings towards the ocean with me. There now is your insular city of the Manhattoes, belted round by wharves as Indian isles by coral reefs. Commerce surrounds it in her surf. Right and left, the streets take you waterward. Its extreme downtown is the Battery, where that noble mole is washed by waves and cooled by breezes, which a few hours previous were out of sight of land. Look at the crowds of water gazers there. Footnote: the Roman statesman Cato the Younger, 95 to 46 BC, killed himself rather than submit to Caesar. Circumambulate the city of a dreamy Sabbath afternoon. Go from Corlear's Hook to Coenties Slip, and from hence by Whitehall northward. What do you see? Posed like silent sentinels all around the town stand thousands upon thousands of mortal men fixed in ocean reveries, some leaning against the spiles, some seated upon their pier heads, some looking over the bulwarks of ships from China, some high aloft in the rigging as if striving to get to a still better seaward peep. But these are all landsmen of weekdays pent up in lath and plaster, tied to counters, nailed to benches, clenched to desks. How then is this? Are the green fields gone? What do they hear? But look, here comes more crowds, pacing straight for the water and seemingly bound for a dive. Strange. Nothing will content them but the extremists' limit of the land. Loitering under the shady lee of yonder warehouses will not suffice. No, they must get just as nigh the water as they possibly can without falling in. And there they stand, miles of them, leagues, inlanders all. They come from lanes and alleys, streets and avenues, north, east, south, and west. Yet here they all unite. Tell me, does the magnetic virtue of the needles and of the compass of all those ships attract them hither? Once more, say, you are in the country, in some high land of lakes. Take almost any path you please, and 10 to 1 it carries you down in the dale, and leaves you there by a pool and the stream. There is magic in it. Let the most absent-minded of men be plunged in his deepest reveries. Stand that man on his legs, set his feet a-going, and he will infallibly lead you to water, if water there be in all that region. Should you ever be athirst in the great American desert, try this experiment, if your caravan happened to be supplied with a metaphysical professor. As everyone knows, meditation and water are wedded forever. But here is an artist. He desires to paint you the dreamiest, shadiest, quietest, most enchanting bit of romantic landscape in all the valley of the Saco. What is the chief element he employs? There stands his trees, each with a hollow trunk as if a hermit and a crucifix were within, and here sleeps his meadow, and there sleep his cattle, and up from yonder cottage goes a sleepy smoke. Deep into the distant woodlands winds a mazy way, reaching to overlapping spurs of mountains bathed in their hillside blue. But though the picture lies thus tranced, and though this pine tree shakes down its sighs like heavy leaves upon this shepherd's head, yet all were vain unless the shepherd's eye were fixed upon the magic stream before him. Go visit the prairies in June, for when for scores on scores of miles you wade knee-deep among tiger lilies. What is the one charm wanting? Water. There is not a drop of water there. Were Niagara but a cataract of sand, would you travel your 1,000 miles to see it? Why did the poor poet Tennessee, upon suddenly receiving 2 handfuls of silver, deliberate whether to buy him a coat, which he sadly needed, or invest his money in a pedestrian trip to Rockaway Beach? Why is almost every robust, healthy boy with a robust, healthy soul in him at some time or other crazy to go to sea? Why, upon your first voyage as a passenger, did you yourself feel such a mystical vibration when first told that you and your ship were now out of sight of land? Why did the old Persians hold the sea holy? Why did the Greeks give it a separate deity and own brother of Jove? Surely all this is not without meaning. And still deeper the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the tormenting mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and was drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. Now, when I say that I am in the habit of going to sea whenever I begin to grow hazy about the eyes and begin to be overconscious of my lungs, I do not mean it to have it inferred that I ever go to sea as a passenger. For to go as a passenger you must needs to have a purse, and a purse is but a rag unless you have something in it. Besides, passengers get seasick, grow quarrelsome, don't sleep of nights, do not enjoy themselves much, as a general thing. No, I never go as a passenger, nor, though I am something of a salt, do I ever go to sea as a commodore or a captain or a cook. I abandon the glory and distinction of such offices to those who like them. For my part, I abominate all honorable, respectable toils, trials, and tribulations of every kind whatsoever. It is quite as much as I can do to take care of myself without taking care of ships, barques, brigs, schooners, and whatnot. And as for going as cook, though I confess there is considerable glory in that, a cook being a sort of officer on shipboard, yet somehow I never fancied broiling fowls, though once broiled, judiciously buttered, and judgmatically salted and peppered, there is no one who will speak more respectfully, not to say reverentially, of a broiled fowl than I will. It is out of the idolatrous doings of the old Egyptians upon broiled ibis and roasted river horse that you see the mummies of those creatures in their huge bakehouses, the pyramids. No, when I go to sea, I go as a simple sailor, right before the mast, plumb down into the forecastle, aloft there to the royal masthead. True, they rather order me about some and make me jump from spar to spar like a grasshopper in a May meadow, and at first this sort of thing is unpleasant enough. It touches one's sense of honor, particularly if you become of an old established family in the land. The Rensselaers or Randolphs or Hardicanuts. And more than all, if if just previous to putting your hand into that tar pot you have been lording it as a country schoolmaster, making the tallest boys stand in awe of you. The transition is a key one, I assure you, from a schoolmaster to a sailor, and requires a strong decoction of Seneca and the Stoics to enable you to grin and bear it. But even this wears off in time. What of it if some old hunks of a sea captain orders me to get a broom and sweep down the decks? What does that indignity amount to, weighed, in the scale of the New Testament? Do you think the Archangel Gabriel thinks anything the less of me because I promptly and respectfully obeyed that old hunks in that particular instance? Who ain't a slave? Tell me that. Well, then, however the old sea captains may order me about, however they may thump and punch me about, I have the satisfaction of knowing that it is all right, that everybody else is one way or other served in much the same way, either in a physical or metaphysical point of view, that is, and so the universal thump is passed round and all hands should rub each other's shoulder blades and be content. Again, I always go to the sea as a sailor because they make a point of paying me for my trouble, whereas they never pay passengers a single penny that I ever heard of. On the contrary, passengers themselves must pay, and there is all the difference in the world between paying and being paid. The act of paying is perhaps the most uncomfortable infliction that the two orchard thieves entailed upon us. But being paid, what will compare with it? The urbane activity with which a man receives money is really marvelous, considering that we so earnestly believe money to be the root of all earthly ills, and that on no account can a moneyed man enter heaven. Ah, how cheerfully we consign ourselves to perdition.
To the TCS Victory, Colonel.
Finally, I always go to sea as a sailor, but because of the wholesome exercise and pure air of the forecastle deck. As in this world, headwinds are far more prevalent than winds from astern, that is, if you never violate the Pythagorean maxim. So for the most part, the Commodore on the quarterdeck gets his atmosphere at second hand from the sailors on the forecastle. He thinks he breathes at first, but not so. In much the same way do the commonalty
You're in my home now.
lead their leaders and many other things at the same time that the leaders little suspect it. But wherefore it was that after having repeatedly smelt the sea as a merchant sailor, I should now take it into my head to go on a whaling voyage. This the invisible police officer of the fates, who has the constant surveillance of me, and secretly dogs me and influences me in some unaccountable way, he can better answer than anyone else. And doubtless my going on this whaling voyage formed part of the grand program of Providence that was drawn up a long time ago. It came in a sort of brief interlude and solo between more extensive performances. I take it that this part of the bill must have run something like this. Grand contested election for the presidency of the United States. Whaling voyage by one Ishmael. Bloody battle in Afghanistan. Though I cannot tell why it was exactly at those stage managers, the fates, put me down for this shabby part of a whaling voyage, when others were set down for magnificent parts in high tragedies, and short and easy parts in genteel comedies, and jolly parts in farces, though I cannot tell why this was exactly yet, now that I recall all the circumstances. I think that I can see a little into the springs and motives which began cunningly presented to me under various disguises, induced me to set about performing the part I did, besides cajoling me into the delusion that it was a choice resulting from my own unbiased free will and discriminating judgment. Chief among these motives was the overwhelming idea of the great whale himself. Such portentous and mysterious monster roused by all my curiosity. Then the wild and distant seas where he rolled his island bulk, and undeliverable nameless perils of the whale, yet these with all the attending marvels of 1,000 Patagonian sights and sounds, helped to sway me to my wish. With other men, perhaps such things would not have been inducements, but as for me, I am tormented with an everlasting itch for things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous coasts. Not ignoring what is good, I am quick to perceive a horror and could still be social with it, would they let me, since it is but well to be on friendly terms with all the inmates of the place one lodges in. By reason of these things, then, the whaling voyage was welcome. The great floodgates and the wonder world swung open, and in the wild conceits that swayed me to my purpose, two and two there floated into my inmost soul endless processions of the whale, and in midmost of them all, one grand hooded phantom like a snow hill in the air. And that was chapter 1. That was more poetic than I was actually expecting. I am not a YouTube partner anymore, and this is now a 15-minute long video. So regardless of if I actually upload this or not, I'm going to end it here. Considering I had not seen some of those words before, I think it did a pretty good job. I've never read this book before, and I just find it easier to read while somehow recording myself. And we'll see how the book goes. I wasn't expecting him to have been a school teacher before becoming a sailor, though it does explain the flowery language. So I'm already liking this more than I thought I would, and I can't wait to read more. Bye-bye. Moby Dick, Chapter 2, The Carpet Bag. I stuffed a shirt or two into my old carpet bag. I tucked it under my arm and started for Cape Horn in the Pacific. Quitting the good city of old Manhattan, I dully arrived in New Bedford. It was on a Saturday night in December. Much was I disappointed upon learning that the little packet for Nantucket had already sailed, and that no way of reaching the place would offer till the following Monday. As most young candidates for the pains and penalties of whaling stop at this same New Bedford, hence to embark on their voyage, it may as well be related that I, for one, had no idea of doing so. For my mind was made up to sail in no other than a Nantucket craft, because there was a fine, boisterous something about everything connected with that famous old island, which amazingly pleased me. Besides, though New Bedford has of late been gradually monopolizing the business of whaling, and though in this matter poor old Nantucket is now much behind her, yet Nantucket was her great original, the Tyre of this Carthage, the place where the first dead American whale was stranded. Where else but from Nantucket did those aboriginal whalemen, the red men, first sally out in canoes to give chase to the Leviathan? And where but from Nantucket, too, did that first adventurous little sloop put forth partly laden with the imported cobblestones? So goes the story, to throw at the whales in order to discover when they were nigh enough to risk a harpoon from the bowsprit.
When my life's on the line, I want a wingman I can trust.
Now having a night, a day, and still another night following before me in New Bedford, ere I could embark for my distant port, it became a matter of concernment where I was to eat and sleep. Meanwhile, it was a very dubious-looking, nay, a very dark and dismal night, bitingly cold and cheerless. I knew no one in the place. With anxious grapnels, I had sound in my pocket, and only brought up a few pieces of silver. So wherever you go, Ishmael, said I to myself as I stood in the middle of a dreary street shouldering my bag and comparing the gloom towards the north with the darkness towards the south. Wherever in your wisdom you may conclude to lodge for the night, my dear Ishmael, be sure to inquire the price and don't be too particular.
Play along with it.
With halting steps, I paced the streets and passed the sign of the crossed harpoons, but it looked too expensive and jolly there. Further on from the bright red windows of the Swordfish Inn, there came such fervent rays that it seemed to have melted the packed snow and ice from before the house, for everywhere else the congealed frost lay 10 inches thick in a hard asphaltic pavement, rather weary for me when I struck my foot against the flinty projections, because from hard remorseless service the soles of my boots were in the most miserable plight. Too expensive and jolly again, I thought, pausing one moment to watch the broad glare in the street and hear the sounds of the tinkling glasses within. But go on, Ishmael, said I at last. Don't you hear? Get away from before the door. Your patched boots are stopping the way.
I don't have anything better
So on
to
I
do.
went.
Okay,
Now
pulled
by
into a tight
instinct
loop,
followed the
locked
streets
onto
that took
cat's
me
tail, fired
waterward,
off a heat seeker,
for there
boom,
doubtless
turned him
were
into
the
kitty flick.
cheapest,
It
if
was
not the cheeriest inns. Such dreary
Well,
streets,
well.
blocks of blackness, not
If it
houses
isn't
on
the
either hand, and
colonel.
here and there a candle, like a candle
I'm
moving
sorry.
about
I
in a
couldn't make your
tomb.
welcoming party.
At this hour
Well, I
of the
guess
night
you
of
had
the
more
last day of the
classy
week, that
maneuvers
quarter
undertaken,
of the
yeah.
town proved all but deserted.
Duty calls.
But presently I
I'm
came
there.
to a smoky light proceeding from a
Women
low,
like the
wide
smell of
building,
success.
the door of which stood invitingly open.
You know, I'm
It had a
surprised you haven't
careless
been blown
look,
out of
as
the
if
sky
it
by
were
now,
meant for
maniac.
the uses of the public.
By friendly
So,
fire.
entering, the first thing I did was to stumble over
Some
an ash
people
box
appreciate
in the
my
porch.
flying style.
Ha, thought
I
I.
think it's necessary
Ha,
to
as
win,
the flying
okay?
particles almost
Suppose
choked
you're
me.
still flying
Are
with
these
one eye on the
ashes
race
from that
manual.
destroyed city,
I don't take
Gomorrah?
stupid risks.
But the crossed harpoons
Speaking
and the
of stupid,
swordfish,
I
this
also
then
heard you put
must be the
Hobbs
sign
back on
of the
flight
trap.
roster.
However, I picked myself
Who the
up and hearing a
travels
loud
fast
voice
on this
within,
town?
pushed on and opened a second
Never
interior
understood
door.
what I saw in that cat. Simple.
It seemed the great
I
black
can deal with
parliament
wingmen I
sitting
can
in
count
a
You can't
toffet,
trust someone who will kill their own kind.
which is
Who
valley
I
south
choose
of
as my wingman is
Jerusalem,
my
symbolic of
prerogative.
hell.
Privilege of rank.
100 black faces
I'll bet you
turned
stay up
round
late
in their
nights just
rows
polishing
to
it up.
peer, and beyond a
No,
black
as a matter
angel
of
of
fact, I
doom
have
was beating
majors
a
who
book
do that
in
for
a
me.
pulpit.
The
It
difference in our rank
was
is a formality.
the
We both know
old
it's better
book.
in the cockpit. Yeah,
We do.
let me tell you that story again. So,
It was a Negro church. And the preacher's text was about the blackness of darkness, and the weeping and the wailing and the teeth gnashing there. Ha, Ishmael, muttered I, backing out. Wretched entertainment at the sign of the trap.
Colonel Blair, report to the briefing room immediately. Colonel Blair,
Moving on, I at last came to a dim sort of out-hanging light not far from the docks, and heard a forlorn creaking in the air. And looking up, I saw a swinging sign over the door with a white painting upon it, faintly representing a tall, straight jet
Colonel
of
Blair,
misty
report to the
spray,
briefing room.
and
Colonel
these
Blair,
words
report to the
underneath: "The Spouter Inn, Peter Coffin." Coffin? Spouter? Rather ominous
Colonel Blair,
in that
report to the
particular
briefing room.
connection,
Colonel
thought
Blair,
I.
report to the briefing room.
But it is a common name in Nantucket, they say, and I suppose this Peter here is an emigrant from there. As the light looked so dim, and the place for the time looked quiet enough, and the dilapidated little wooden house itself looked as if it might have been carted here from the ruins of some burnt district, and as the swinging sign had a poverty-stricken sort of creak to it, I thought that here was the very spot for cheap lodgings and the best of pea coffee. It was a queer sort of place, a gable-ended old house, one side palsied, as it were, and leaning over sadly. It stood on a sharp, bleak corner where the tempestuous wind,
Colonel Blair, report to the briefing room. Colonel Blair, report to the briefing room.
Euroclydon, kept up a worse howling than it ever did about poor Paul's tossed wrath. Euroclydon, nevertheless, is a mighty pleasant zephyr
Not much for
to
protocol,
anyone indoors, with his feet on the hob quietly toasting for bed.
Most of your time just trying to survive.
Euroclydon is wind that shipwrecked St. Paul. See the Bible, Acts
Well, I guess
27.
you have to adapt to your
Okay.
surroundings.
Don't I know that?
In judging of that tempestuous
It's an
wind
art,
called
really.
Euroclydon,
No
said
wonder
an
they
old
call you
writer, of whose works I possess the
doing your
only copy
homework, I
extant,
see.
it maketh a marvelous
Yeah, I knocked
difference
her
whether
out,
thou
And yet
lookest
your combat file is
out
surprisingly brief.
at it from a
Looks
glass
for the big
window
gaps
where
in
the
your
frost
bio.
is all on the
Can I
outside,
help it if
or whether
content
thou
possessive like my
observest
data?
it from that
He's got a point.
sashless window where the frost is on both sides and of which the white
Sometimes
death
HQ
is
as
only
big
the
a mystery to me as
glazier.
the enemy.
Is the only glazier. True enough, thought I, that
We got a lot
as
of good
this
people here,
passage
Colonel.
occurred to my mind,
Even those of us
old,
with an incomplete
old
bio,
black letter, thou
just give us a chance.
reasonest well. Yes, these eyes are windows, and this body of mine is the house. What a pity they didn't stop What a pity they didn't stop up the
Welcome
chinks and the
aboard, sir.
crannies, though,
Wanna play
and
a
thrust in a little lint here and there. But it's too late to make any improvements now. The universe is finished, the copestone is on, and the chips were carted off a million years ago. Poor Lazarus there, chattering his teeth against the curbstone for his pillow and shaking off his tatters with his shiverings. He might plug up both ears with rags and put a corn cob into his mouth, and yet that would not keep out the tempestuous Euroclydon. Euroclydon, says old Dives in his red silken wrapper. He had a redder one afterwards. Pooh pooh. What a fine frosty night, how Orion glitters, what northern lights. Let them talk of the Oriental summer climes of everlasting conservatories. Give me the privilege of making my own summer with my own coals. But what thinks Lazarus? Can he warm his blue hands by holding them up to the grand northern lights? Would not Lazarus rather be in Sumatra than here?
Colonel Blair, report
Would
to the
he
briefing
not
room.
far
Colonel Blair,
rather
report to the briefing room.
lay him down lengthwise along the line of the equator? Yeah, ye gods, go down to the fiery pit itself in order to keep out of this
Colonel Blair,
frost.
report to the briefing room.
Now that
Colonel Blair,
Lazarus
report to the
should
briefing
lie stranded there on the curbstone before the door of Dives, this is more wonderful than that an iceberg should be moored to one of the Moluccas. Yet Dives himself, he too lives like a czar in an ice palace made of frozen sighs, and being a president of a temperance society, he only drinks the tepid tears of orphans. But no more of this blubbering now, and we are going a whaling, and there is plenty of that yet to come. Let us scrape the ice from our frosted feet and see what sort of place this Spouter may be. Okay. I knew Lazarus was brought back from the dead by Jesus in the Bible,
Colonel Blair,
though
report to the
I'm not
briefing room. Colonel Blair,
100%
report to the
sure
briefing room.
if that whole passage is talking about before he was raised from the dead or after. Oh well.
Colonel Blair,
And
report to the
then
briefing room. Colonel Blair, report to the
Moluccas
briefing room.
is also called the Spice Islands in the Malay archipelago.
Colonel Blair, report to the briefing room. Colonel Blair, report to the briefing room.
Archipelago. Well, we encountered some words that I would not have said if they were not in the book. I probably should have thought to expect that, considering how old this book is. It's 1800s
Colonel Blair,
era.
report to the briefing room. Colonel Blair, report to the...
If I'm blanking on the specific year, but I do know that
Come in,
a lot
Colonel.
of people didn't actually
Time to
read
put
this
that
book when it
reputation
first
of
came
yours
out.
to the test.
And
Combat
Herman
intelligence tells
Melville
us that the karate
was,
presence is growing
he did
here
a
in
lot
the
of
Ossini
whaling
system.
and was a lot
You
very
and your
experienced
wingman
with
are to
lots
fly
of
routine
boats
patrol of
and
these
whales,
three zones,
and
sweep
that
the
most of his
area
writing
of
was
any
actually
hostiles you may
autobiographical.
encounter. Understood.
But this is his only fiction book as far as I'm aware. And and we're just going to have to accept
these
that
are the
sometimes he
mission
uses words
objectives.
we don't use anymore or shouldn't be using
Oh, and
anymore.
one last thing.
Because old 1800s, man.
Hobbs,
Yeah.
you're on my wing for this one. Dismissed, and good luck.
Chapter 3, The Spouter Inn. Entering that gable-ended Spouter Inn, you found yourself in a wide, low, straggling entry with old-fashioned wainscots, reminding one of the bulwarks of some condemned old craft.
You got a problem
On
with
one
that,
side hung a very large oil painting, so thoroughly besmoked and every way defaced that in the unequal cross-lights by which you viewed it, it was only by diligent study and a series of systematic visits to it and careful inquiry of the neighbors that you could in any way arrive at an understanding of its purpose. Such unaccountable masses of shades and shadows that at first you almost thought some ambitious young artist in the time of the New England hags had endeavored to delineate chaos bewitched. But by dint of much and earnest contemplation and oft-repeated ponderings, and especially by throwing out open the little window towards the back of the entry, you at last come to the conclusion that such an idea, however wild, might not be altogether unwarranted. But what most puzzled and confounded you was a long, limber, portentous black mass of something hovering in the center of the picture over three blue, dim, perpendicular lines floating in a nameless yeast. A boggy, soggy, switchy picture, truly enough to drive a nervous man distracted. Yet was there a sort of indefinite, half-attained, unimaginable sublimity about it that fairly froze you to it till you involuntarily took an oath with yourself to find out what that marvelous painting meant. Ever and anon a bright, but alas, deceptive idea would dart you through. It's the Black Sea in a midnight gale. It's the unnatural combat of the four primal elements. It's a blasted heath. It's a Hyperborean winter scene. It's the breaking up of an icebound stream of time. But at last all these fancies yielded to that one portentous something in the picture's midst. That once found out, and all the rest were plain. But stop, does it not bear a faint resemblance to a gigantic fish, even the great Leviathan himself? In fact, the artist's design seemed this, a final theory of my own, partly based upon the aggregated opinions of many aged persons with whom I conversed upon the subject. The picture represents a Cape Horner in a great hurricane, the half-foundered ship weltering there with its three dismantled masts alone visible, and an exasperated whale purposing to spring clean over the craft is in the enormous act of impaling it himself upon the three mastheads. The opposite wall of this entry was hung all over with a heathenish array of monstrous clubs and spears. Some were thickly set with glittering teeth resembling ivory saws, others were tufted with knots of human hair, and one was sickle-shaped with a vast handle sweeping round like the segment made in the new-mown grass by a long-armed mower. You shuddered as you gazed and wondered what monstrous cannibal and savage could ever have gone a death harvesting with such a hacking, horrifying implement. Mixed with these were rusty old whaling lances and harpoons all broken and deformed. Some were storied weapons. With this once long lance, now wildly elbowed, 50 years ago did Nathan Swain kill 15 whales between a sunrise and a sunset. And that harpoon, so like a corkscrew now, was flung in Javan seas and run away with by a whale, years afterwards slain off the Cape Blanco. The original iron entered nigh the tail, and like a restless needle sojourning in the body of a man, traveled full 40 feet, and at last was found embedded in the hump. Crossing this dusky entry and on through yon low arched way, cut through what in old times must have been a great central chimney with fireplaces all round, you enter the public room. A still duskier place this, with such low, ponderous beams above and such old, wrinkled planks beneath, that you would almost fancy you trod some old craft's cockpits, especially of such a howling night, when this corner-anchored old ark rocked so furiously. On one side stood a long, low, shelf-like table covered with cracked glass cases, filled with dusty rarities gathered from this wide world's remotest nooks. Projecting from the further angle of the room stands a dark-looking den, the bar, a rude attempt at a right whale's head. Be that how it may, there stands the vast arched bone of the whale's jaw, so wide a coach might almost drive beneath it. Within are shabby shelves ranged around with old decanters, bottles, flasks, and in those jaws of swift destruction, like another cursed Jonah, by which name indeed they called him, bustles a little withered old man who, for their money, dearly sells the sailors deliriums in death. Abominable are the tumblers into which he pours his poison, though true cylinders within the villainous green goggling glasses deceitfully tapered downwards to a cheating bottom. Parallel meridians rudely pegged into the glass surround these footpads goblets. Fill to this mark, and your charge is but a penny. To this, a penny more, and so on to the full glass, the Cape Horn measure, which you may gulp down for a shilling. Upon entering the place, I found a number of young seamen gathered about the table, examining a dim light divers specimens of skirmshander, usually skimshaw, scenes drawn on or objects carved from whalebone or teeth.
What's your status?
I'm happy to
That's what
report
a
that I've covered no
skirmshander is. Scenes drawn on or objects carved from whale teeth or bone. Okay. I sought the landlord, and telling him I desired to be accommodated with a room, received for answer that his house was full, not a bed unoccupied. But avast, he added, tapping his forehead, you hain't no objections to sharing a harpooner's blanket, have ye? I suppose you are a goin' a whalin', or so you'd better get used to that sort of thing. I told him that I never liked to sleep two in a bed, that if I should ever do so, it would depend who the harpooner might be, and that if he, the landlord, really had no other place for me, and the harpooner was not decidedly objectionable, why, rather than wander further down about a strange town on so bitter a night, I would put up with not the half of any decent man's blanket. I thought so. All right, take a seat. Supper? You want supper? Supper'll be ready directly. I sat down on an old wooden settle carved all over like a bench on the Battery, which is the southern tip of Manhattan in New York City.
Objectives accomplished.
At one end, a ruminating tar was still further adorning it with his jackknife, stooping over and diligently working away at the space between his legs. He was trying his hand at a ship under a full sail, but he didn't make much headway, I thought. At last, some 4 or 5 of us were summoned to our meal in an adjoining room. It was cold as Iceland, no fire at all. The landlord said he couldn't afford it. Nothing but 2 dismal tallow candles, each in a winding sheet. We were fain to button up our monkey jackets and to hold our lips cups of scalding tea with our half-frozen fingers. But the fare was of the most substantial kind, not only meat and potatoes, but dumplings. Good heavens! Dumplings for supper! One young fellow in a green box coat addressed himself to these dumplings in the most direful manner. My boy, said the landlord, you'll have the nightmare to a dead Sartanty? Sartanty. Sartanty. Landlord, I whispered. That
Pretty
ain't the
slick lines
harpooner,
there.
is it?
Thanks,
Oh,
Chief.
no, said he, looking a sort of diabolically funny. The harpooner is a dark-complexioned chap. He never eats dumplings, he eats nothing but steaks and likes them rare. The devil he does, says I. Where's that harpooner? Is he here? He'll be here afore long, was the answer. I could not help it, but I began to feel suspicious of this dark-complexioned harpooner. At any rate, I made up my mind that if it so turned out that we should sleep together, he must undress and get into bed before I did. I don't know what that means, but okay. Supper over, the company went back to the bar room when,
Just like
knowing
old times,
not
huh?
what else to do with myself, I resolved to spend the rest of the evening as a looker-on. Presently, a rioting noise
forget
was
it,
heard
Hobbs.
without.
You're
Starting
back
up,
where you belong now.
the landlord cried, That's the Grampus's crew. I seed her reported in the offing this morning, a 3 years voyage in a full ship. Hurrah, boys, now we'll have the latest news from the Fijis. A tramping of sea boots was heard in the entry, the door was flung open, and in rolled a wild set of mariners enough, enveloped in their shaggy watch coats and with their heads muffled in woolen comforters, all bedarned and ragged, and their beards stiff with icicles. They seemed an eruption of bears from Labrador. They had just landed from their boat, and this was the first house they entered. No wonder, then, that they made a straight wake for the whale's mouth, the bar, when the wrinkled old Jonah, there officiating, soon poured them out brimmers all round. One complained of a bad cold in his head, upon which Jonah mixed him a pitch-like potion of gin and molasses, which he swore was a sovereign cure for all colds and catarrhs whatsoever. Never mind of how long standing or whether caught off the coast of Labrador or on the weather side of an ice island. Catarrhs. Catarrhs. Okay. I don't know what that is. I will have to look it up. The liquor soon mounted into their heads, as it generally does, even with the
Good day, sir. At ease, Lieutenant. Carry on.
Sorry,
Arantes
sir.
toppers
Vaquero from the
newly
Celeste system.
landed from the sea, and they began capering about
You
most
tell a lot about a system from
obstreperiously.
music, you know? Some places it's all
Obstreperiously.
minor chords. Makes you just want to run out and
I
do a
observed,
suicide
however,
mission.
that one of them held
This is
somewhat
right.
aloof, and though he seemed
Makes you wanna live a
desirous
long life.
not to spoil the hilarity of his shipmates by his own sober
I'm a
face,
pilot, sir.
yet upon the
Pretty good
whole
one,
he
too, check
refrained
my
from
kill
making
score.
as much noise as the
My
rest.
family,
This man interested
they
me
made
at
guitars
once, and
many
since the sea
generations.
gods had ordained that he should
got
soon
one
become my
almost
shipmate,
200 years
though
old.
but a sleeping partner one so far as his narrative is concerned, I
Someday,
will
I'm gonna
here
open a
venture
cantina,
upon a little
bringing
description
the
of
best
him.
to play that
He
guitar.
stood full
Place
6
for
feet
old
in
fighter
height
guys
with
like you
noble
and me.
shoulders and a chest like a cofferdam.
Line up some other
I have seldom seen
many of
such
us
brawn in a
Oh,
man.
yeah. It'll
His
be
face
open
was
to
deeply
one
brown and
all.
burnt,
And
making
me,
his white
I'll
teeth
just sit back,
dazzling
gaze at
by
the
the
beautiful
contrast,
women,
while in the deep shadows of his eyes floated some reminiscences that did not seem to give him much joy. His voice at once announced that he was a southerner, and from his fine stature I thought he must be one of those tall
Some of
mountaineers
these guys,
from
they
the
actually like the killing. Me,
Allegheny Ridge in Virginia.
I just walk away when this is
When
all
the
over.
revelry of his companions had mounted to its height, this man slipped away unobserved, and I saw no more of him till he became my comrade on the sea. In a few minutes, however, he was missed by his shipmates, and being, it seems, for some reason a huge favorite with them, they raised a cry of, "Bulkington! Bulkington! Where's Bulkington?" and darted out of the house in pursuit of him. Oh, that's a reference to See Chapter 23, The Lee Shore.
Time we talk, Lieutenant.
Ain't much to talk about,
That might be
sir.
a spoiler.
You've flown with it, and you both got the job
Okay.
done.
If you're referring to Hobbs,
I can't fly with him, sir.
if you stay
It
on
was
this ship,
now
you'll
about
have to
9
sooner or
o'clock
later.
and the
Don't
room
put me in a
seeming
position of
almost
having to defend him. I won't do
supernaturally
it.
quiet
Let's just
after
say I'm
these
hardwired that way,
orgies.
and
I
nothing
began
you
to
do's gonna change
congratulate
that.
myself upon a little plan that had occurred to me just
I'll try and
previous
keep you two separate
to the
on that.
entrance
That's
of the
beside
seaman.
I'm not asking for special favors.
We
No man
need
prefers to
every good
sleep
pilot
two
we've
in a
got,
bed.
just so
In
you
fact,
know,
you would
I
know a
trust
good
Hobbs
deal
with my
rather
life.
not this.
That's your choice.
You would a good deal rather not sleep with your own brother. I don't know how it is, but people like to be private when they are sleeping. And when it comes to sleeping with an unknown stranger in a strange inn in a strange town and that stranger a harpooner, then your objections indefinitely multiply. Nor was there any earthly reason why I, as a sailor, should sleep two in a bed more than anybody else, for sailors no more sleep two in a bed at sea than bachelor kings do ashore. To be sure, they all sleep together in one apartment, but you have your own hammock and cover yourself with your own blanket and sleep in your own skin. The more I pondered over this harpooner, the more I abominated the thought of sleeping with him. It was fair to presume that being a harpooner, his linen or woolen, as the case might be, would not be of the tidiest, certainly none the finest. I began to twitch all over. Besides, it was getting late, and my decent harpooner ought to be home and going bedwards. Suppose now he should tumble in upon me at midnight. How could I tell from what vile hole he had been coming? Landlord, I've changed my mind about that harpooner. I shan't sleep with him. I'll try the bench here. Just as you please. I'm sorry I can't spare ye a tablecloth for a mattress, and it's a plaguey rough board here, feeling of the knots and notches. But wait a bit, Scrimshander. I've got a carpenter's plane there in the bar. Wait, I say, and I'll make ye snug enough. So saying, he procured the plane, and with his old silk handkerchief, first dusting the bench, vigorously set to planing away at my bed, the while grinning like an ape. I don't like it when people are compared to apes. I know we are apes, technically, but my soul. The shavings flew right and left till at last
Let's
the
get
plane
started,
iron
Colonel.
came bump
Yes, sir.
against the indestructible knot.
One of
The
our
landlord
tracking
was near
stations report
spraining his
Iraqi
wrist, and I
activity
told
in
him,
these regions.
for
I'd like
heaven's
you
sake,
to
to
run a
quit.
patrol
The bed was
there,
soft enough to
sweep the
suit me,
area.
and I did not know
The station's
how
report
all the
is sketchy.
planning
You might
in the
encounter some
world
sort of
could make eater
karate
down
capture.
of a pine plank. So gathering up
Colonel.
the shavings with another grin and throwing them into the great stove in the middle of the room, he went about his business and left me in a brown study. I now took the measure of the bench and found that it was a foot
these
too
are the
short,
mission
that could be
objectives.
mended with a chair. But it was a foot too narrow, and
one
the other
last thing.
bench in the room was about 4 inches higher than the planed one, so there was no yoking them. I then placed the first bench lengthwise along the only clear space against the wall,
Maniac,
leaving a little interval
leave my
between for
wingman.
my back to settle
Don't
down
make me
in.
regret it.
But I soon found that there
Dismissed.
came such a draught of
Good
cold
luck.
air over me that from under the sill of the window that this plan would never do at all, especially as another current from the rickety door met the one from the window, and both together formed a series of small whirlwinds in the immediate vicinity of the spot where I had thought to spend the night. The devil fetch that harpooner, thought I, but stop. Couldn't I steal a march on him, bolt his door inside, and jump into his bed, not to be wakened by the most violent knockings? It seemed no bad idea, but upon second thoughts I dismissed it, for who could tell but what the next morning, so soon I popped out of the room, the harpooner might be standing in the entry, all ready to knock me down. Still, looking around me again, and seeing no possible chance of spending a sufferable night unless in some other person's bed, I began to think that, after all, I might be cherishing unwarrantable prejudices against this unknown harpooner. Thinks I, I'll wait a while. He must be dropping in before long. I'll have a good look at him then, and perhaps we may become jolly good bedfellows after all. There's no telling. But though the other boarders kept coming in ones by ones, twos, and threes and going to bed, yet no sign of my harpooner. Landlord, said I, what sort of chap is he? Does he always keep such late hours? It was now hard upon 12 o'clock. The landlord chuckled again with his lean chuckle and seemed to be mightily tickled by something beyond my comprehension. No, he answered, generally he's an early bird, early to bed and early to rise. Yes, he's the bird that catches the worm, but tonight he went out a-peddling, you see, and I don't see what on earth keeps him so late unless maybe he can't sell his head. Can't sell his head? What sort of bamboozling story is this you're telling me? Getting into a towering rage. Do you pretend to say, landlord, this harpooner actually engaged this blessed Saturday night, or rather Saturday morning, in peddling his head around this town? That's precisely it, said the landlord, and I told him he couldn't sell it here. The market's overstocked. With what? Shouted I. With heads, to be sure. Ain't there too many heads in the world? I tell you what it is, landlord, said I quite calmly. You'd better stop spinning that yarn to me. I'm not green. Maybe not, taking out a stick and whittling a toothpick. But I rather guess you'll be done brown if that ere harpooner hears you slandering his head. I'll break it for him, said I, now flying into a passion again as this unaccountable farrago of the landlord's. It's broke already, he said. He broke, I said. Broke, do you mean? Certain, and that's the very reason he can't sell it, I guess.
Break an attack.
I have no idea what they're talking about. Landlord, said I, going up to him as cool as Mount Hecla in a snowstorm. Landlord, stop whittling. You and I must understand one another, and that too without delay. I come to your house and want to bed. You tell me you can only give me half of one, that the other half belongs to a certain harpooner, and about this harpooner, whom I have not yet seen, you persist in telling me the most mystifying and exasperating stories, tending to beget in me an uncomfortable feeling towards the man who you designed for my bedfellow, a sort of connection, landlord, which is an intimate and confidential one in the highest degree. I now demand of you to speak out and tell me who and what this harpooner is, and whether I shall be in all respects safe to spend the night with him. And in the first place, you will be so good as to unsay that story about selling his head, which, if true, I take to be good evidence that this harpooner is stark mad, and I have no idea of sleeping with a madman. And you, sir, landlord, you, sir, by trying to induce me to do so knowingly, would thereby render yourself liable to a criminal prosecution. Wall, said the landlord, fetching a long breath. That's a pretty long sermon for a chap that rips a little now and then. But be easy, this here harpooner I've been telling you of has just arrived from the South Seas, where he brought up a lot of bombed New Zealand heads, great curios, you know, and he sold all on them but one, and that one he's trying to sell tonight, 'cause tomorrow's Sunday, and it would not do to be selling human heads about the streets when folks is going to church. He wanted to last Sunday, but I stopped him just as he was going out of the door with 4 heads strung on a string, for all the arth like a string of Indians. This account cleared up the otherwise unaccountable mystery, and showed that the landlord, after all, had no idea of fooling me. But at the same time, what could I think of a harpooner who stayed out on a Saturday night clean into the holy Sabbath, engaged in such a cannibal business as selling the heads of dead idolaters? Depend on it, landlord, that harpooner is a dangerous man. He pays regular, said the rejoinder. But come, it's getting dreadful late. You had better be turning flukes. It's a nice bed. Sal and me slept in that air bed the night we were spliced. There's plenty of room for 2 to kick about in that bed. It's an almighty big bed, that. Why, afore we give it up, Sal used to put our Sam and little Johnny in the foot of it. But I got a dreamin' and sprawlin' about one night, and somehow Sam got pitched on the floor and came near breaking his arm. Arter that, Sal said it wouldn't do. Come along here, I'll give ye a glim in a jiffy. And so saying, he lighted a candle and held it toward me, offering to lead the way. But I stood irresolute when, looking at a clock in the corner, I exclaimed, I vomit Sunday. You won't see that harpooner tonight. He's come to anchor somewhere. Come along then. Do come. Won't ye come? I considered the matter a moment, and then upstairs we went, and I was ushered into a small room, cold as a clam, and furnished, sure enough, with a prodigious bed, but almost big enough, indeed, for any 4 harpooners to sleep abreast. There, said the landlord, placing the candle on a crazy old sea chest that did double duty as a washstand and center table. There, make yourself comfortable now, and good night to ye. I turned round from eyeing the bed, but he had disappeared. Folding back the counterplane, I stooped over the bed. Though none the most elegant, it yet stood the scrutiny tolerably well. I then glanced around the room, and beside the bedstead and center table I could see no other furniture belonging to the place but a rude shelf and 4 walls, and a papered fireboard representing a man striking a whale. Of things not properly belonging to the room, there was a hammock lashed up and thrown upon the floor in one corner. There was also a large seaman's bag containing the harpooner's wardrobe, no doubt in lieu of a land trunk. Likewise, there was a parcel of outlandish bonefish hooks on the shelf of over the fireplace, and a tall harpoon standing at the head of the bed. But what is this on the chest? I took it up and held it close to the lamplight, and felt it and smelt it, and tried every way possible to arrive at some satisfactory conclusion concerning it. I compared it to nothing but a large doormat, ornamented at the edges with little tinkling tags, something like the stained porcupine quills round an Indian moccasin. There was a hole or slit in the middle of this mat, as you see the name in South American ponchos. But could it be possible that any sober harpooner would get into a doormat and parade the streets of any Christian town in that sort of guise? I put it on to try it, and it weighed me down like a hamper, being uncommonly shaggy and thick, and I thought a little damp, as though this mysterious harpooner had been wearing it of a rainy day. I went up in it to a bit of glass stuck against the wall, and I never saw such a sight in my life. I tore myself out of it in such a hurry that I gave myself a kink in the neck. I sat down on the side of the bed, and commenced thinking about this head-peddling harpooner and his doormat. After thinking some time on the bedside, I got up and took off my monkey jacket, and then stood in the middle of the room thinking. I then took off my coat and thought a little more in my shirt sleeves. But beginning to feel very cold now, half undressed as I was, and remembering what the landlord had said about the harpooners not coming home at all that night, it being so very late, I made no more ado and jumped out of my pantaloons and boots, and then blowing out the light, tumbled into bed and commended myself to the care of heaven. Whether that mattress was stuffed with corn cobs or broken crockery, there was no telling, but I rolled about a good deal and could not sleep for a long time. At last I slid off into a light doze, and had pretty nearly made a good offing towards the land a nod, when I heard the heavy footfall in the passage, and saw a glimmer of light come into the room from under the door. Lord save me, thinks I, that must be the harpooner, the infernal head peddler. But I lay perfectly still, and resolved not to say a word till spoken to. Holding a light in one hand and that identical New Zealand head in the other, the stranger entered the room, and without looking toward the bed, placed his candle a good way off from me on the floor in one corner, and began working away at the knotted cords of the large bag I before spoke of as being in the room. I was all eagerness to see his face, but he kept it averted for some time while employed in unlacing the bag's mouth. This accomplished, however, he had turned around, when, good heavens, what a sight, such a face! It was of a dark purplish-yellow color, here and there, and stuck over with large blackish-looking squares. Yes, it's just as I thought. He's a terrible bedfellow. He's been in a fight, got dreadfully cut, and here he is just from the surgeon. But at that moment he chanced to turn his face so toward the light that I plainly saw they could not be sticking plasters at all, those black squares on his cheeks. They were stains of some sort or other. At first I knew not what to make of this, but soon an inkling of the truth occurred to me. I remembered a story of a white man, a whale man too, who, falling among the cannibals, had been tattooed by them. I concluded that this harpooner, in the course of his distant voyages, must have met with a similar adventure. And what is it, thought I, after all? It's only his outside. A man can be honest in any sort of skin. But then, what to make of his unearthly complexion, that part of it, I mean, lying round about, and completely independent of the squares of tattooing? To be sure, it might be nothing but a good coat of tropical tanning, but I never heard of a hot sun's tanning a white man into a purplish yellow one. However, I had never been in the South Seas, and perhaps the sun there produced these extraordinary effects upon the skin. Now, while all these ideas were passing through me like lightning, this harpooner never noticed me at all, but after some difficulty, having opened his bag, he commenced fumbling in it and presently pulled out a sort of tomahawk and sealskin wallet with the hair on. Placing these on the old chest in the middle of the room, he then took the New Zealand head, a ghastly thing enough, and crammed it down into the bag. He now took off his hat, a new beaver hat, when I came nigh, singing out with fresh surprise. There was no hair on his head, none to speak of at least, nothing but a small scalp knot twisted up on his forehead. His bald, purplish head now looked for all the world like a mildewed skull. Had not the stranger stood between me and the door, I would have bolted out of it quicker than I had ever bolted a dinner. Even as it was, I thought something of slipping out of the window, but it was the second floor back. I am no coward, but what to make of this head-peddling purple rascal altogether past my comprehension. Ignorance is the parent of fear, and being completely nonplussed and confounded by the stranger, I confess I was now as much afraid of him as if it was the devil himself who had thus broken into my room at the dead of night. In fact, I was so afraid of him that I was not game enough to just then address him and demand a satisfactory answer concerning what seemed inexplicable in him. Meanwhile, he continued the business of undressing and at last showed his arms and chest. As I live, these covered parts of him were checkered with the same squares as his face. His back, too, was all over the same dark squares. He seemed to have been in a 30 years' war and just escaped from it with a sticking plaster shirt. Still more, his very legs were marked as if a parcel of dark green frogs were running up the trunks of young palms. It was now quite plain that he must be some abominable savage or other shipped abroad of a whaleman in the South Seas, and so landed in this Christian country. I quake to think of it. A peddler of heads, too, perhaps the heads of his own brothers. He might take a fancy to mine. Heavens, look at that tomahawk! But there was no time for shuddering, for now the savage went about something that completely fascinated my attention and convinced me that he must indeed be a heathen. Going to his heavy grego, which is a jacket, grego, or rapal, or dreadnought, which he had previously hung on a chair, he fumbled in the pockets and produced at length a curious little deformed image of a hunch, with a hunch on its back and exactly the color of a 3-days-old Congo baby. I don't even know what that means. Remembering the embalmed head, at first I almost thought that this black mannequin was a real baby preserved in some similar manner, but seeing that it was not at all limber and that it glistened a good deal like polished ebony, I concluded that it must be nothing but a wooden idol, which indeed it proved to be, for now the savage goes up to the empty fireplace and, removing the papered fireboard, sets up this little hunchbacked image like a tin pin between the andirons. The chimney jab... What? The chimney jams? Jams? Jambs. And all the bricks inside were very sooty, so that I thought this fireplace made a very appropriate little shrine or chapel for his Congo doll. I now screwed my eyes hard toward the half-hidden image, feeling but ill at ease meantime, to see what was next to follow. First, he takes about a double handful of shavings out of his grego pocket and places them carefully before the idol, then laying a bit of ship biscuit on top and applying the flame from the lamp, he kindled the shavings into a sacrificial blaze. Presently, after many hasty snatches into the fire, and still hastier withdrawals of his fingers, whereby he seemed to be scorching them badly, he at last succeeded in drawing out the biscuit. Then, blowing off the heat and ashes a little, he made a polite offer of it to the little I can't do it today. Negro. But the little devil did not seem to fancy such dry sort of fare at all. He never moved his lips. All these strange antics were accompanied by still stranger guttural noises from the devotee, who seemed to be praying in a sing-song or else singing some pagan psalmody or other, during which his face twitched about in the most unnatural manner. At last, extinguishing the fire, he took the idol up very unceremoniously and bagged it again in his grego pocket, as carelessly as if he were a sportsman bagging a dead woodcock. All these queer proceedings increased my uncomfortableness, and seeing him now exhibiting strong symptoms of concluding his business operations and jumbling into bed with me, I thought it was high time, now or never, before the light was put out, to break the spell in which I had been so long bound. But the interval I spent in deliberating what to say was a fatal one. Taking up his tomahawk from the table, he examined the head of it for an instant, then holding it to the light, with his mouth at the handle, he puffed out great clouds of tobacco smoke. The next moment the light was extinguished, and this wild cannibal, tomahawk between his teeth, sprang into bed with me. I sang out. I could not help it now, and giving a sudden grunt of astonishment, he began feeling me. Stammering out something, I knew not what, I rolled away from him against the wall, and then conjured him, whoever or whatever he might be, to keep quiet and let me get up and light the lamp again. But his guttural responses satisfied me at once that he but ill comprehended my meaning. "Ooh, a devil you," he at last said. "You no speaky, damn me, I..." What? Why did they have to... I think what that's supposed to be is, "Who the devil are you?" You don't speak. Damn. I think he's saying that if he doesn't speak up, he's gonna kill him. So saying, the lighted tomahawk began flourishing about me in the dark. "Landlord, for God's sakes, Peter Coffin!" shouted I. "Landlord, watch! Coffin! Angel, save me!" Speaky, telly me who he be, or dammy I kill he. I think what that's supposed to mean is that he wants him to say something, tell him who he is, or he's gonna kill him. I think. Again growled the cannibal, while his horrid flourishings of the tomahawk scattered the hot tobacco ashes about me till I thought my linen would get on fire. But thank heaven, at that moment the landlord came into the room, light in hand, and leaping from the bed, I ran up to him. Don't be afraid now, said he, grinning again. Queequeg here wouldn't harm a hair on your head. Stop your grinning, shouted I, and why didn't you tell me that infernal harpooner was a cannibal? I thought you knowed it. Didn't I tell you he was peddling heads round town? But turn flukes again and go to sleep. Queequeg, look here. You stabby me, I stabby you. Let this man sleep at you. You sabby? What the hell? Me sabby plenty, grunted Queequeg, puffing away at his pipe and sitting up in bed. I think that's slang writing for another slang word, which is savvy. So he's saying, you understand me, I understand you. This man sleep with you. You savvy? Then he says, I savvy plenty. I think that's what that says. You get in, he added, the landlord, motioning to me with his tomahawk. Oh. Ugh. Then why is that a different paragraph? I don't know who's talking. Motioning to me with his tomahawk and throwing the clothes to one side. He really did this in not only a civil, but a really kind and charitable way. I stood looking at him a moment. For all his tattooings, he was on the whole a clean, comely looking cannibal. What's all this fuss I have been making about? I thought I to myself. The man's a human being, just as I am. He has just as much reason to fear me as I have to be afraid of him. Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. Landlord, said I, tell him to stash his tomahawk there, or pipe, or whatever you call it. Tell him to stop smoking, in short, and I will turn in with him. But I don't fancy having a man smoking in bed with me. It's dangerous. Besides, I ain't insured. This being told to Queequeg, he at once complied, and again politely motioned me to get into bed, rolling over to one side as much as to say, I won't touch a leg of ye. Good night, landlord, said I. You may go. I turned in and never slept better in my life. Okay, so historical racism aside, that was actually really entertaining. I was strongly reminded of fanfic tropes, specifically, and there was only one bed. So my brain immediately went to fanfic that probably exists. And I know that Herman Melville had, in his other writings, which are autobiographical, he has written other stuff about cannibalism and ending up on islands with natives that he at least says are cannibals. I haven't really fact-checked or even read those autobiographical stories. I mostly know this from the chapter that was focusing on Herman Melville in this book I have about sperm whales. That was kind of what made me want to read Moby Dick in the first place. This book I have about sperm whales that went all about, ended up going into a lot of detail about Herman Melville and how he was this whaler for a long time, and that his book wasn't actually all that popular when it came out. But anyway, like, obviously I'm not really comfortable with the obviously racist stuff. I don't like comparing people to like monkeys or anything like that, and I'm not really comfortable with use of words that I don't really use. And like, I know that last video I said it, but this time it was just bleh. What else? Oh, when it mentioned tallow candles, tallow is actually candles made from animal fat. So if something says that it's made of tallow, that means that it's made of animal fat. And I know that from when I did education stations at, I used to be an educational interpreter at Stone Mountain Park on its little historic square area. And one thing that I learned about candles from the 1800s is that some of them, if it was made of tallow, it was made from animal fat. And I think that was also the case for like soap. So that's what tallow candles means, and means that it smells like burning animal fat, and the flame doesn't look the same. It's a lot more smoky and dirty looking when a candle is being burned from, when there's a flame coming from a tallow anything. So it's not as bright or as when it's from a wax candle. I actually kind of like Queequeg. I think that his dialogue is unnecessarily written in I think his dialogue is written in a way that's trying to get his accent across so much that it's actually difficult to figure out what he's saying, which I don't think is obviously I think that's entirely unnecessary, but in terms of like this as an introduction to who he is as a character, I actually like him already, and I like that Ishmael in a lot of ways kind of reminds me of like people today who like get really worked up over stuff, and then it's like like he was talking himself down from being racist and wasn't doing a very good job of it, but he got over it, and that's a very modern thing, so I thought that was really interesting. That was something that he did, and I did kind of like that even though he was being a little bit racist, and that the character is sort of written in a way that's kind of racist a little bit, or a lot, but I'm not a good judge of these things, but I like that he still had like reasonable objections. Like, I really didn't know what was going on with the head thing until it turned out, oh, he's trying to sell shrunken heads.
Nice.
Which is definitely illegal now, but wasn't always illegal.
That's not what I'm doing.
That's all the thoughts I have right now. The chapter was a little longer than I thought it was going to be, so I didn't have a glass of water with me. So I am going to drink some water now. So,
alright, let me see.
Yeah.
Gorilla going down tonight. Blanca Ball is easy if you do back.
We might be interrupted by a phone call, but I'm gonna read what
and
I
low
can
kick.
right now. I got a glass of water. Got the book. Chapter 4, The Counterpane. Upon waking next morning about daylight, I found Queequeg's arm thrown over me in the most loving and affectionate manner. You had almost thought I had been his wife. The counterpane was of patchwork, full of odd little parti-colored squares and triangles, and this arm of his tattooed all over with an indeterminable Cretan labyrinth of a figure, no two parts of which were of one precise shade, owing, I suppose, to his keeping his arm at sea unmethodically in sun and shade, his shirt sleeves irregularly rolled up at various times. This same arm of his, I say, looked for all the world like a strip of that same patchwork quilt.
And it's not because I'm charging, it's because I'm trying to hold my ground. Because I like to combo out of a crouched
Greek myth, a complex structure built by Daedalus of King Minos to house the great monster Minotaur. Oh, I thought it was attached to the Cretan part, not the labyrinth. You know what a labyrinth is? Anyway.
Beach. Oh man, I missed the beach.
Indeed, partly lying on it as the arm did when I first awoke, I could hardly tell it from the quilt, they so blended their hues together, and it was only by the sense of weight and pressure that I could tell that Queequeg was hugging me. My sensations were strange. Let me try to explain them. When I was a child, I well remember a somewhat similar circumstance that befell me. Whether it was a reality or a dream, I could never entirely settle. The circumstance was this. I had been cutting up some caper or other. I think it was trying to crawl up the chimney, as I had seen a little sweep do a few days previous, and my stepmother, who, somehow or other, was all the time whipping me or sending me to bed supperless, my mother dragged me out by the legs out of the chimney and packed me off to bed, though it was only 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 21st of June, the longest day of the year in our hemisphere. I felt dreadfully, but there was no help for it, so upstairs I went to my little room in the 3rd floor, undressed myself as slowly as possible as to kill time, and with a bitter sigh got between the sheets. I lay there dismally calculating that 16 entire hours must elapse before I could hope for a resurrection. 16 hours in bed. The small of my back ached to think of it. And it was so light, too, the sun shining in that at the window, and a great rattling of coaches in the streets, and the sound of gay voices all over the house. I felt worse and worse. At last I got up, dressed, and softly going down in my stockinged feet, sought out my stepmother, and suddenly threw myself at her feet, beseeching her as a particular favor to give me a good slippering for my misbehavior, anything indeed but condemning me to lie abled as such an undurable length of time. But she was the best and the most conscientious of stepmothers, and back I had to go to my room. For several hours I lay there broad awake, feeling a great deal worse than I have ever done since, even from the greatest subsequent misfortunes. At last I must have fallen into a doubled nightmare of a doze, and slowly waking from it, half steeped in dreams, I opened my eyes, and before sunlit room was now wrapped in outer darkness. Instantly I felt a shock running through all my frame. Nothing was to be seen, nothing was to be heard, but a supernatural hand seemed placed in mine. My arm hung over the counterpane, and the nameless, unimaginable, silent form or phantom to which the hand belonged seemed closely seated by my bedside. For what seemed ages piled on ages, I lay there frozen with the most awful fears, not daring to drag away my hand, yet ever thinking that if I could but stir it 1 single inch, the horrid spell would be broken. I knew not how this consciousness at last glided away from me, but waking in the morning, I shudderingly remembered it all, and for days and weeks and months afterwards I lost myself in confounding attempts to explain the mystery. Nay, to this very hour, I often puzzle myself with it. Now take away the awful fear, and my sensations at feeling the supernatural hand in mine were very similar in their strangeness to those which I experienced on waking up and seeing Queequeg's pagan arm thrown around me. But at length all the past night's events soberly recurred, one by one, in fixed reality, and then I lay only alive to the comical predicament. For though I tried to move his arm, unlock his bridegroom clasp, yet sleeping as he was, he still hugged me tightly, as though naught but death should part us twain. I now strove to rouse him. Queequeg! But his only answer was a snore. I then rolled over, my neck feeling as if it were a horse collar, and suddenly felt a slight scratch. Throwing aside the counterpane, there lay the tomahawk sleeping by the savage's side, as if it were a hatchet-faced baby. A pretty pickle, truly, thought I, abled here in a strange house in the broad day, with a cannibal and a tomahawk. Queequeg! In the name of goodness, Queequeg, wake! At length, by dint of much wriggling and loud incessant expostulations, upon the unbecomingness of his hugging a fellow male in that matrimonial sort of style, I succeeded in extracting a grunt. And presently he drew back his arm, shook himself all over like a Newfoundland dog, just from the water, and sat up in bed, stiff as a pike staff, looking at me and rubbing his eyes as if he did not altogether remember how I came to be there, though a dim consciousness of knowing something about me seemed slowly dawning over him. Meanwhile, I lay quietly eyeing him, having no serious misgivings now, and bent upon narrowly observing so curious a creature. When at last his mind seemed made up touching the character of his bedfellow, he became, as it were, reconciled to the fact. He jumped out upon the floor, and by certain signs and sounds gave me to understand that, if it pleased me, he would dress first, and leave me to dress afterwards, leaving the whole apartment to myself. Thinks I, Queequeg, under the circumstances, this is a very civilized overture, but the truth is...
It's a local attorney here in Montana.
I'm too racist,
nice,
how many go?
Attorney
But the truth is, these savages have an innate sense of delicacy. Say what you will. It is marvelous how essentially polite they are. I pay this particular compliment to Queequeg because he treated me with so much civility and consideration while I was guilty of great rudeness, staring at him from the bed and watching all his toilet motions. For the time, my curiosity getting the better of my breeding. Nevertheless, a man like Queequeg you don't see every day, and he and his ways were well worth unusual regarding. He commenced by dressing at top by donning his beaver hat, a very tall one by the by, and then, still minus his trousers, he hunted up his boots. What under the heavens he did it for, I cannot tell, but his next movement was to crush himself, boots in hand and hat on, under the bed, when, from sundry violent gasping and strainings, I inferred he was hard at work booting himself, though by no law of propriety had I ever heard of, is any man required to be private when putting on his boots. But Queequeg, do you see, was a creature in the transition state, neither caterpillar nor butterfly. He was just enough civilized to show off his outlandishness in the strangest possible manner. His education was not yet completed. He was an undergraduate. If he had not been a small degree civilized, he very probably would not have troubled himself with the boots at all. But then, if he had not been still a savage, he never would have dreamt of getting under the bed to put them on.
Well, why don't you use that instead? Didn't you say you were trying to
I'm not
find a
sure I
controller or
understood that sentence, but okay. At last he emerged with his hat very much dented and crushed down over his eyes and began creaking and limping about the room as if not being much accustomed to boots. His pair of damp, wrinkled cowhide ones, probably not made to order either, rather pinched and tormented him at the first go of a bitter cold morning. Seeing now that there were no curtains to the window and that the street being very narrow, the house opposite commanded a plain view into the room, and observing more and more the indecorous figure that Queequeg made, staving about with little else but his hat and boots on, I begged him as well as I could to accelerate his toilet somewhat, and particularly to get into his pantaloons as soon as possible. He complied and then proceeded to wash himself. At that time in the morning any Christian would have washed his face, but Queequeg, to my amazement, contented himself with restricting his ablutions to his chest, arms, and hands. He then donned his waistcoat and, taking up a piece of hard soap on the washstand's center table, dipped it into water and commenced lathering his face. I was watching to see where he kept his razor when, lo and behold, he takes the harpoon from the bed corner, slips out the long wooden stock, unsheathes the head, wets it a little on his boot, and striding up to the bit of mirror against the wall, begins a vigorous scraping, or rather harpooning, of his cheeks. Thinks I, Queequeg, this is using Roger's best cultery with a vengeance. Afterwards, I wondered the less at this operation when I came to know of what fine steel head of a harpoon is made, and how exceedingly sharp the long, straight edges are always kept.
And right now,
the rest of his toilet was soon achieved, and he proudly marched out of the room, wrapped up in his great pilot monkey jacket, and sporting his harpoon like a marshal's baton.
Because I have to go to like a slower controller, in my opinion.
Oh, okay.
That's why I got
Chapter
this,
5
because
is
it's
only
like
a few pages,
these
so I'm
buttons
going to
are
go
really
ahead
fast.
and read Chapter 5.
It's just this D-pad here.
Chapter 5, Breakfast. I quickly followed suit, and descending into the bar room, accosted the grinning landlord very pleasantly. I cherished no malice towards him, though he had been skylarking with me not a little in the matter of my bedfellow. However, a good laugh is a mighty good thing, and rather too scarce a good thing, the more's the pity. So, if any one man, in his own proper person, affords stuff for a good joke to anybody, let him not be backward, but let him cheerfully allow himself to spend and be spent in that way. And the man that has anything bountifully laughable about him, be sure there is more in that man than you perhaps think for. The bar room was now full of the boarders who had been dropping in the night previous, and whom I had not as yet had a good look at. They were nearly all whalemen, chief mates and second mates and third mates and sea carpenters and sea coopers and sea blacksmiths and harpooners and shipkeepers, a Brown and Barney company with bosky beards and unshorn shaggy set, all wearing monkey jackets for morning gowns. You could pretty plainly tell how long each one had been ashore. This young fellow's healthy cheek is like a sun-toasted pear in hue, and would seem to smell almost as musky. He cannot have been 3 days landed from his Indian voyage. That man next to him looks a few shades lighter. You might say a touch of satin wood is in him. In the complexion of a third still lingers a tropic ton, but slightly bleached. Withal, he doubtless has tarried whole weeks ashore, but who could show a cheek like Queequeg, which barred with various tints seemed like the Andes' western slope to show forth in one array contrasting climax zone by zone? Grub ho, now cried the landlord, flinging open a door, and in we went to breakfast. They say that men who have seen the world thereby come quite at ease in manner, quite self-possessed in company. Not always, though. Laydyard, the great New England traveler, and Mungo Park, the Scotch one, of all men they possess the least assurance in the parlor. But perhaps the mere crossing of Siberia in a sledge drawn by dogs as Ledyard did, or the taking of a long, solitary walk on an empty stomach in the Negro heart of Africa, which was the sum of poor Mungo's performances. This kind of travel, I say, may not be the very best mode of attaining a high social polish. Still, for the most part, that sort of thing is to be had anywhere. These reflections are occasioned by the circumstance that after we were all seated at the table, and I was preparing to hear some good stories about whaling, to my no small surprise, nearly every man maintained a profound silence. And not only that, but they looked embarrassed. Yes, here were a set of sea dogs, many of whom, without the slightest bashfulness, had boarded great whales on the high seas, entire strangers to them, and dueled them dead without winking. Yet here they sat at a social breakfast table, all the same seat calling, all the kindred tastes, looking around as sheepishly at each other as though they had never been out of sight of some sheepfold among the Green Mountains. A curious sight, these bashful bears, these timid warrior whalemen. But as for Queequeg, why, Queequeg sat there among them, at the head of the table too, it so chanced, as cool as an icicle. To be sure, I cannot say much for his breeding. His greatest admirer could not have cordially justified his bringing his harpoon in to breakfast with him, and using it there without ceremony, reaching over the table with it to the imminent jeopardy of many heads and grappling the beefsteaks towards him. He's using the harpoon to get his food. Oh, I love it. Where was I? But that was certainly very coolly done by him, and everyone knows that in most people's estimation, to do anything coolly is to do it genteelly. We will not speak of all of Queequeg's peculiarities here, how he eschewed coffee and hot rolls, and applied his undivided attention to beefsteaks done rare, enough that when breakfast was over he withdrew like the rest into the public room, lighted his tomahawk pipe, and was sitting there quietly digesting and smoking with his inseparable hat on when I sailed out for a stroll. Just gonna... Okay, another short one. Okay, we have a couple more short chapters. So, Chapter 6, The Street. If I had been astonished at first catching a glimpse of so outlandish an individual as Queequeg circulating among the polite society of a civilized town, that astonishment was soon departed upon taking my first daylight stroll through the streets of New Bedford. In thoroughfares nigh the docks, any considerable seaport will frequently offer to view the queerest looking nondescripts from foreign parts. Even in Broadway and Chestnut Streets, Mediterranean mariners will sometimes jostle the affrighted ladies. Regent Street is not unknown to Lascars and Malays, and at Bombay and the Apollo Green live Yankees have often scared the natives, but New Bedford beats all Water Street in whapping. In these last-mentioned haunts you see only sailors, but in New Bedford actual cannibals stand chatting at street corners, savages outright, many of whom yet carry on their bones unholy flesh. What the Jesus. It makes a stranger stare. But besides the Fijians, Tongata Boers, Aromangoans, Panangians, and Brigians, and besides the wild specimens of the whaling craft which unheeded reel about the streets, you will see other sights still more curious, certainly more comical. There weekly arrive in this town scores of green Vermonters and New Hampshire men, all athirst for gain and glory in the fishery. They are mostly young, of stalwart frames, fellows who have felled forests and now seek to drop the axe and snatch the whale lance. Many are as green as the green mountains whence they came. In some things you would think them but a few hours old. Look there, that chap strutting round the corner. He wears a beaver hat and swallow-tailed coat, girdled with a sailor belt and sheath knife. Here comes another with a sou'wester and a bombazine cloak. Okay, so those words that I stumbled on a lot, those are referencing people from the Polynesian Islands, in case I mispronounced that so bad you couldn't tell. And bombazine is cotton fabric. The Indian city Bombay has become known for it, apparently, according to the little annotation at the end of the page. No town-bred dandy will compare with the country-bred one. I mean, a downright bumpkin dandy, a fellow that, in the dog days, will mow his 2 acres in buckskin gloves for fear of tanning his hands. Now, when a country dandy like this takes it into his head to make a distinguished reputation and joins the great whale fishery, you should see the comical things he does upon reaching the seaport. And beseeking his sea outfit, he orders bell buttons to his waistcoats, straps to his canvas trousers. Ah, poor hayseed, how bitterly will burst those straps in the first howling gale when thou art driven, straps, buttons, and all, down the throat of the tempest. But think not that this... There's a knock at the door, and I'm going to investigate it. Okay, unexpected, but that was the lady with my pet sitting money. Okay, where were we?
Right there, that was my block of balls because I'm not holding it.
You were a little after bomb disease, but we did poor hayseed. Okay. But think not that this famous town has only harpooners, cannibals, and bumpkins to show her visitors. Not at all. Still, New Bedford is a queer place. Had it not been for us whalemen, that tract of land would this day perhaps have been in as howling condition as the coast of Labrador. As it is, the parts of her back country are enough to frighten one, they look so bony. The town itself is perhaps the dearest place to live in all New England. It is a land of oil, true enough, but not like Canaan, a land also of corn and wine. The streets do not run with milk, nor in the springtime do they pave them with fresh eggs. Yet, in spite of this, nowhere in all America will you find more patrician-like houses, parks and gardens more opulent than in New Bedford. Whence came they? How planted upon this once scraggy scoria of a country? Go and gaze upon the iron emblematical harpoons round yonder lofty mansion, and your question will be answered. Yes, all these brave houses and flowery gardens came from the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. One and all they were harpooned and dragged up hither from the bottom of the sea. Can Alexander perform a feat like that? Apparently, Alexander was a popular magician of the time. In New Bedford, fathers, they say, give whales of dowers to their daughters and portion off their nieces with a few porpoises apiece. You must go to New Bedford to see a brilliant wedding, for they say they have reservoirs of oil in every house, and every night recklessly burn their links in spermaceti candles. In summertime, the town is sweet to see, full of fine maples, long avenues of green and gold, and in April, high in air, the beautiful and bountiful horse chestnuts, candelabra-wise, proffer the passerby with their tapering upright cones of congregated blossoms. So omnipotent is art, which in many a district of New Bedford has superinduced bright terraces of flowers upon the barren, refuse rocks thrown aside at creation's final day. And the women of New Bedford, they bloom like their own red roses, but roses only bloom in summer, whereas the fine carnation of their cheeks is perennial as sunlight in the seventh heavens. Elsewhere match that bloom of theirs ye cannot save in Salem, where they tell me the young girls breathe such musk their sailor sweethearts smell them miles offshore, as though they were drawing nigh the odorous Moluccas instead of the puritanic sands. I am not going to pretend like I understood what that last sentence was. But that was 3 chapters of Moby Dick. Oh, I didn't notice my microphone wasn't close to my mouth when I came back. I guess I'm gonna stop the video and see if that actually got picked up by my mic, but I'm not gonna reread anything. I'm just not. But I like Queequeg a lot. I think he's easily my favorite character right now. And I kind of find Ishmael to be kind of funny. Because he's racist. Like, that's not funny, but just the way that like, he's being ridiculous, and I know that, and even he sort of knows that, and that's what makes it funny, that he sort of knows that he's being ridiculous. And like, it is kind of interesting to see how like old ways of thinking were just sort of silly. Like, and some of it was just rude. Like, I mean, you guys heard me read it. You know it was rude. He's kind of a rude man. And, like, the idea that, like, his behavior wasn't becoming of his breeding or whatever. We all know people behave that way regardless of anything, or, like, it would be something that you would expect from a white guy, so like that's not true at all. That it's against his nature or whatever. So he was funny for that reason. I actually really like how this is written. It kind of flows like poetry. So I really like that. And I'm very entertained so far. Kind of amused that Captain Ahab hasn't shown up at all, and I don't even really care. And I like that my fanfic tropes are showing up. I like that Ishmael clearly does like Queequeg, even if he's kind of racist about it. And I hope they get to continue to be good friends. Or become better friends. I love the thing with the harpoon. That was so funny. Getting his breakfast meat. No one would take it from him with using a harpoon. So I was like, maybe I should get a harpoon to get my breakfast food with. Breakfast. That sounds good.
Okay, so I figured that this would be easier especially on my computer's memory. I just made a live video, and then people who were interested could watch it later. And that way, I don't have to worry about my computer memory while recording videos and stuff like that. And I wasn't really like I was editing these anyway. So, there you go. And if anyone does show up and has questions they want to ask, whether about the book or me, there is that live chat thing. Though I'm not really expecting anybody to show up right now for this. So, purely for your later viewing pleasure. And I got water bottle right here, so shouldn't get too thirsty. Chapter 7. The Chapel. In this same New Bedford, there stands a whaleman's chapel, and a few are the moody fishermen, shortly bound for the Indian Ocean or Pacific, who fail to make a Sunday visit to the spot. I am sure that I did not. Returning from my first morning stroll, I again sallied out upon this special errand. The sky had changed from clear sunny cold to driving sleet and mist. Wrapping myself in my shaggy jacket of the cloth called bearskin, I fought my way against the stubborn storm. Entering, I found a small scattered congregation of sailors and sailors' wives and widows. A muffled silence reigned, only broken at times by the shrieks of the storm. Each silent worshipper seemed purposefully sitting apart from the other, as if each silent grief were insular and incommunicable. The chaplain had not yet arrived, and there these silent islands of men and women sat steadfastly eyeing the several marble tablets with black borders masoned into the wall on either side of the pulpit. Of three of them ran something like follows, but I do not pretend to quote. Sacred to the memory of John Talbot, who at the age of 18 was lost overboard near the Isle of Desolation off Patagonia, November 1st, 1836. This tablet is erected to his memory by his sister. Sacred to the memory of Robert Long, Willis Ellery, Nathan Coleman, Walter Canny, Seth Macy, and Samuel Gleig, forming one of the boat's crews of the ship Eliza, who were towed out of sight by a whale on the offshore ground in the Pacific. December 31st, 1839, this marble here is placed here by their surviving shipmates. Sacred to the memory of the late Captain Ezekiel Hardy, who in the bows of his boat was killed by a sperm whale off the coast of Japan. August 3rd, 1833, this tablet is erected to his memory by his widow. Shaking off the sleet from my ice-glazed hat and jacket, I seated myself near the door, and turning sideways was surprised to see Queequeg near me. Affected by the solemnity of the scene, there was a wondering gaze of incredulous curiosity in his countenance. This savage was the only person present who seemed to notice, because he was the only one who could not read, and therefore was not reading those frigid inscriptions on the wall. How do you know? Was that established earlier that he doesn't know how to read, or are you just assuming? Whatever. I don't remember. If anyone remembers, leave a comment, please. Whether any of the relatives of the seamen whose names appeared there were now among the congregation, I knew not. But so many are the unrecorded accidents of the fishery, and so plainly did several women present wear the countenance, if not the trappings, of some unceasing grief, that I feel sure that here before me were assembled those in whose unhealing hearts the sight of those bleak tablets sympathetically caused the old wounds to bleed afresh. Oh, ye whose dead lie buried beneath the green grass, who standing among flowers can say, Here, here lies my beloved. Ye know not the desolation that broods in bosoms like these. What bitter blanks in those black bordered marbles which cover no ashes. What despair in those immovable inscriptions. What deadly voids and unbidden infidelities in the lines that seem to gnaw upon all faith, and refuse resurrections to the beings who have placelessly perished without a grave. As well might those tablets stand in the cave of Elephanta as here. I'm checking a footnote. Elephanta seems to be connected to the footnote of near Bombay, India, an island dedicated to worship of the Hindu god Shiva, spirit of destruction. So I'm also needing to check. There that is. Okay. That is what I just read is indeed what Elephanta is. In what census of living creatures the dead of mankind are included? Why is it that a universal proverb says of them that they tell no tales, though containing more secrets than the Goodwin sands? How is it that to his name, who yesterday departed for the other world, we prefix so significant and infidel a word, and yet do not thus entitle him, but if he embarks for the remotest Indies of this living earth? Why the life insurance companies pay death forfeitures upon immortals, and what eternal unstirring paralysis and deadly hopeless trance yet lies antique Adam, and who died 60 round centuries ago, How is it that we still refuse to be comforted for those who we nevertheless maintain are dwelling in unspeakable bliss? Why all the living so strive to hush all the dead? Wherefore but the rumor of the knocking in a tomb will terrify a whole city. All these things are not without their meaning. Okay, the Goodwin Sands are dangerous shoals near the coast of England. But faith, like a jackal, feeds among the tombs, and even from these dead doubts she gathers her most vital hope. It needs scarcely to be told with what feelings, on the eve of a Nantucket voyage, I regarded those marble tablets, and by the murky light of that dark and doleful day read the fate of the whalemen who had gone before me. Yes, Ishmael, the same fate may be thine, but somehow I grew merry again. Delightful inducements to embark, fine chance of promotion, it seems. A stove boat will make me an immortal by brevet. Military promotion without higher pay and with limited exercise of rank. Yes, there is death in this business of whaling, a speechlessly quick, chaotic bundling of a man into eternity. But what then? Methinks we have hugely mistaken this matter of life and death. Methinks that what they call my shadow here on earth is my true substance. Methinks that in looking at things spiritual, we are too much like oysters observing the sun through the water, and thinking that thick water was the thinnest of air. Methinks my body is but the lees of my better being. In fact, take my body who will, take it, I say, and it is not me. And therefore three cheers for Nantucket, and come of the stove boat and the stove body when they will, for stave my soul, Jove himself cannot. Oh, okay, I'm a little unclear on what Ishmael's view on death is, but it does seem like they think that the people in general who are probably not Queequeg, maybe. There's so much about Queequeg that we're not sure is just Ishmael being racist or him actually being that way. Probably meant to be both, but I don't know. That's what headcanons are for. You're trying to piece things together yourself. But anyway, I think what that was about was that people believe that if you're not having like a proper Christian burial or something, you're not getting to heaven, which I guess is why burials are important to be like traditional or whatever, but traditional burial is not good for the environment. Personally, I want a natural burial, but everyone's entitled to their own opinion. Okay, Chapter 8, The Pulpit. I had not been seated very long ere a man of a certain venerable robustness entered. Immediately as the storm-pelted door flew back upon admitting him, a quick regardful eyeing of him by all the congregation sufficiently attested that this fine old man was the chaplain. Yes, it was the famous Father Mapple? Mabel? I'm going to go with Mapple because those are two P's. Father Mapple, so called by the whalemen, among whom he was a very great favorite. He had been a sailor and a harpooner in his youth, but for many years past had dedicated his life to the ministry. At the time I now write of, Father Mapple was in the hardy winter of a healthy old age, and that sort of old age which seems merging into a second flowering youth. For among all the fissures of his wrinkles there shone certain mild gleams of a newly developing bloom, the spring verdure peeping forth even beneath February's snow. No one had been previously heard of his history could for the first time behold Father Mapple without the utmost interest, because they were certain engrafted clerical peculiarities about him, imputable to that adventurous maritime life that he had led. When he entered, I observed that he carried no umbrella and certainly had not come from his carriage, for his tarpaulin hat ran down with the melting sleet, and his great pilot cloth jacket seemed almost to drag him to the floor with the weight of the water it had absorbed. However, hat and coat and overshoes were by one removed, and he hung up in a little space in an adjacent corner when, arrayed in a decent suit, he quietly approached the pulpit. Like most old-fashioned pulpits, it was a very lofty one, and since the regular stairs to such a height would, by its long angle with the floor, seriously contract the already small area of the chapel, the architect, it seemed, had acted upon the hint of Father Mapple and finished the pulpit without stairs, substituting a perpendicular side ladder, like those used in mounting a ship from a boat at sea. The wife of a whaling captain had provided the chapel with a handsome pair of red worsted man ropes for this ladder, which being itself nicely headed and stained with a mahogany color, the whole contrivance, considering what manner of chapel it was, seemed by no means in bad taste. Halting for an instant at the foot of the ladder, and with both hands grasping the ornamental knobs on the man ropes, Father Mapple cast a look upwards, and then, with a truly sailor-like but still reverential dexterity, hand over hand, mounted each steps as if ascending the main top of his vessel. The perpendicular parts of the side ladder, as is usually the case with swinging ones, were of cloth-colored rope. Only the rounds were of wood, so that at every step there was a joint. At my first glimpse of the pulpit, it had not escaped me that, however convenient for a ship, these joints in the present instance seemed unnecessary, for I was not prepared to see Father Mapple, after gaining the height, slowly turn around and stooping over the pulpit, deliberately drag up the ladder step by step till the whole was deposited within, leaving him impregnable in his little Quebec. I pondered some time without fully comprehending the reason for this. Father Mapple enjoyed such a wide reputation for sincerity and sanctity that I could not suspect him of courting notoriety for any mere tricks of the stage. No, thought I, there must be some sober reason for this thing. Furthermore, it must symbolize something unseen. Can it be, then, that by the act of the physical isolation he signifies his spiritual withdrawal for the time from all outward worldly ties and connections? Yes, for replenished with the meat and the wine of the world to the faithful man of God, this pulpit, I see, is not a self-containing stronghold, a lofty Ehrenbreitstein, which a perennial wall of water within the walls. With a perennial well of water within the walls. Okay, Ehrenbreitstein is a castle sited high above the Rhine River. Well, I can Google that later, since I don't know what that is. But the side ladder was not the only strange feature of the place, borrowed from the chaplain's former seafarings. Between the marble cenotaphs on either hand of the pulpit, the wall which formed its back was adorned with a large painting representing a gallant ship beating against a terrible storm off the lee coast of black rocks and snowy breakers. But high above the flying scud and dark rolling clouds, there floated a little isle of sunlight, from which beamed forth an angel's face, and this bright face shed a distinct spot of radiance upon the ship's tossed deck, something like that silver plate now inserted into the Victory's plank where Nelson fell. Horatio Nelson, great British admiral, killed on his ship Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Ah, noble ship, the angel seemed to say, beat on, thou noble ship, and bear a hearty helm, for lo, the sun is breaking through, the clouds are rolling off, serenest azure is at hand. Nor was the pulpit itself without a trace of the same sea taste that had achieved the ladder and the picture. Its paneled front was in the likeness of a ship's buff blows, and the Holy Bible rested on a projecting piece of scrollwork, fashioned after a ship's fiddle-headed beak. What could be more full of meaning, for the pulpit is ever this earth's foremost part. All the rest comes in the rear. The pulpit leads the world. From hence it is the storm of God's quick wrath is first described, and the bow must bear the earliest brunt. For from thence it is the god of breezes, air, or foul is first invoked for favorable winds. Yes, the world's a ship on its passage out, and not a voyage complete, and the pulpit is its prow. I'm actually really impressed by how very little action takes place in each chapter, but the chapters are actually pretty long considering nothing really is happening. Like, each action takes like several paragraphs of one description and then his thoughts on the actions. And Ishmael is full of so many different thoughts and connections, especially literary connections and geographical connections, and he knows like the histories of people he meets sometimes, so he's able to like connect a lot of different dots. And I do think that's really cool for a main character to be able to do. I personally find it pretty relatable, because that actually does sound a little bit like me, just less racist. Definitely less racist.
Did you accept my invite?
Sometimes I have thoughts that are problematic, but the difference is I don't say them. Everyone's a little bit racist. But I try my best and try to do better and improve. And I don't think Ishmael is considered it, aside from accepting that Queequeg isn't all that different from him. But I gotta go to the bathroom, so this live stream is going to have to end for now. But I'll read some more soon.
Hello. Today we are reading more from Moby Dick, starting at chapter 9, and I have a water bottle. So let's get right to it. Chapter 9, the sermon. Father Mapple rose and in a mild voice of unassuming authority ordered the scattered people to condense. Starboard gangway there, side away to labboard. Labboard gangway to starboard. Midships. There was a low rumbling of heavy sea boots among the benches, and a still slighter shuffling of women's shoes, and all was quiet again, and every eye on the preacher. He paused a little, then kneeled in the pulpit's bows, folded his large brown hands across his chest, uplifted his closed eyes, and offered a prayer so deeply devout that he seemed kneeling and praying at the bottom of the sea. This ended in prolonged solemn tones, like the continual tolling of a bell in a ship that is foundering at sea in a fog. In such tones he commenced reading the following hymn, but changing his manner towards the concluding stanzas, burst forth with appealing exultation and joy. The ribs and terrors in the whale arched over me a dismal gloom, while all God's sunlit waves rolled by, and lift me deepening down to doom. I saw the opening maw of hell, with the endless pains and sorrows there, which none but they that feel can tell. Oh, I was plunging to despair. In black distress I called my God, when I could scarce believe him mine. He bowed his ear to my complaints. No more the whale did me confine. With speed he flew to my relief, as on a radiant dolphin borne, awful yet bright, as lightning shone. the face of my deliverer God. My songs forever shall record that joyful hour. I give the glory to my God, his all the mercy and the power. Nearly all joined in singing this hymn, which swelled high above the howling of the storm. A brief pause ensued. The preacher slowly turned over the leaves of the Bible and at last, folding his hand down upon the proper page, said, "Beloved shipmates, clench the last verse in the first chapter of Jonah. And God had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah." Shipmates, this book, containing only 4 chapters, 4 yarns, is one of the smallest stands in the mighty cable of the scriptures. Yet what depths does the soul does Jonah's deep sea line sound? What a pregnant lesson to us is this prophet. What a noble thing is that canticle, C-A-N-T-I-C-L-E, canticle, in the fish's belly. How billow-like and boisterously grand. We feel the flood surging over us. We sound with him to the kelpy bottom of the waters. The seaweed and all the slime of the sea is about us. But what is this lesson that the book of Jonah teaches? Shipmates, it is a two-stranded lesson. A lesson to us all as sinful men, and a lesson to me as a pilot of the living God. As sinful men, it is a lesson to us all because it is a story of the sin, hard-heartedness, suddenly awakened fears, the swift punishment, repentance, prayers, and finally the deliverance and joy of Jonah. As with all sinners among men, the sin of this son of Amittai was in his willful disobedience of the command of God. Never mind now what that command was or how conveyed, which he found a hard command. But all the things that God would have us do are hard for us to do. Remember that, and hence he oftener commands us than endeavors to persuade. And if we obey God, we must disobey ourselves, and it is in this disobeying ourselves wherein the hardness of obeying God consists. With this sin of disobedience in him, Jonah still further flouts at God by seeking to flee from him. He thinks that a ship made by men will carry him into countries where God does not reign, but only the captains of this earth. He skulks about the wharves of Joppa. Joppa? J-O-P-P-A. Seeks a ship that's bound for Tarshish. There lurks perhaps a hitherto unheeded meaning here. By all accounts, Tarshish could have been no other city than the modern Cadiz. C-A-D-I-Z. That's the opinion of learned men. And where is Cadiz? Shipmates, Cadiz is in Spain, as far by water from Joppa as Jonah could possibly have sailed in those ancient days when the Atlantic was an almost unknown sea, because Joppa, the modern Jaffa, shipmates, is on the most easterly coast of the Mediterranean, the Syrian, the Tarshish, or Cadiz, more than 2,000 miles to the westward from that, just outside the Straits of Gibraltar. Gibraltar. See ye not then, shipmates, that Jonah sought to flee worldwide from God? Miserable man, oh, the most contemptible and worthy of all scorn, when slouched hat and guilty eyes, skulking from his God, prowling among the shipping like a vile burglar, hastening to cross the seas. So disordered, self-condemning is his look that had there been policemen in those days, Jonah, on the mere suspicion of something wrong, had been arrested ere he touched a deck. How plainly he's a fugitive. No baggage, not a hat box, valise, or carpet bag. No friends accompany him to the wharf with their adieu. Does adieu have an X at the end? A-D-I-E-U-X. At last, after much dodging, search, he finds the Tarshish ship receiving the last items of her cargo, and as he steps on board to see its captain in the cabin, all the sailors from the moment desist from hoisting in the goods to mark the stranger's evil eye. Jonah sees this, but in vain he tries to look all ease and confidence. In vain essays his wretched smile. Strong intuitions of the man assure the mariners he can be no innocent. In their gamesome but still serious way, one whispers to the other, "Jack, he's robbed a widow," or "Joe, do you mark him? He's a bigamist." Or, "Harry, lad, I guess he's the adulterer that broke jail in old Gomorrah and belike one of the missing murderers from Sodom." How does anyone know that by looking at someone? I don't think that's how that works.
What is cube?
Another runs to read the bill that's stuck against the spile. Spile. Upon the wharf to which the ship is moored, offering 500 gold coins for the apprehension of the parricide. Parricide. And containing a description of his person. He reads and looks from Jonah to the bill, while all his sympathetic shipmates found Jonah prepared to lay their hands upon him. Frightened, Jonah trembles and summons all of his boldness to his face, only looks so much more the coward. He will not confess himself suspected, but that itself is strong suspicion. So he makes the best of it, and when the sailors find him not to be the man that is advertised, "Who's there?" cries the captain at his busy desk, hurriedly making out his papers for the customs. "Who's Tarshish? How soon sail ye, sir?" Thus far the business stands before him, but no sooner does he hear that hollow voice, they darts aside. At last he slowly answers, still intently eyeing him. "No sooner, sir? Soon enough for any honest man that goes a passenger." "Ha! Jonah, that's another stab." But he swiftly calls away the captain from that scent. "I'll sail with ye," he says. "The passage money, how much is that?" "I'll pay now. For it is particularly written, shipmates, that if it were, they paid the fare thereof ere the craft did sail. And taken with the context, this is full of meaning." Now Jonah's captain, shipmates, was one whose discernment detects crime in any, but whose cupidity exposes it only in the penniless. How much longer do they talk about this?
Where's that Speedo?
Okay. In this world, shipmates, sin that pays its way can travel freely and without passport, whereas virtue, if a pauper, is stopped at all frontiers. So Jonah's captain prepares to test the length of Jonah's purse ere he judge him openly. He charges him thrice the usual sum, and it's assented to. Then the captain knows that Jonah is a fugitive, but at the same time resolves to help a flight that pays its rear with gold. Yet when Jonah finally takes out his purse, prudent suspicions still molest the captain. That's unfortunate wording. He rings every coin to find a counterfeit. Not a forger anyway, he mutters, and Jonah is put down for his passage. "Point out my stateroom, sir," says Jonah now. "I'm travel weary, I need sleep." "Thou lookest like it," said the captain. "There's thy room." Jonah enters and would lock the door, but the lock contains no key. Hearing him foolishly fumbling there, the captain laughs lowly to himself and mutters something about the doors of convict cells never being allowed to be locked within. All dressed and dusty as he is, Jonah throws himself to his berth and finds the little stateroom ceiling almost resting on his forehead. The air is close and Jonah gasps, and then in that contracted hole sunk too, beneath the ship's waterline, Jonah feels the heralding presentiment of that stifling hour when the whale shall hold him in the smallest of his bowels wards.
I
Screwed at its axis against the side, the swinging lamp slightly oscillates in Jonah's room, and the ship, heeling over towards the wharf with the weight of the last bales received, the lamp flame and all, though in slight motion, still maintains a permanent obliquity with reference to the room, though in truth infallibly straight itself, it but made obvious the false lying levels among which it hung. The lamp alarms and frightens Jonah, as lying in his berth the tormented eyes roll around the place, and this thus far successful fugitive finds no refuge for his restless glance. But that contradiction in the lamp more and more appalls him. The floor, the ceiling, and the side are all awry. So my conscience hangs in me, he groans, straight upward so it burns, and the chambers of my soul are all in crookedness. I know I'm not done with the chapter, but I'm actually not all that familiar with this Bible story. Did Jonah do something bad before getting on the ship, or is this just having doubts in God or something? Like, I don't fully know what's going on. I'm not that familiar with my Bible stuff. Oh well. Like one who after a night of drunken revelry hides to his bed, still reeling but with conscience yet prickling him as the plungings of the Roman racehorse, but so much the more strike his steel tags into him, as one who in that miserable plight still turns and turns in giddy anguish, praying God for annihilation until the fit be past, and at last amid the whirl of woe he feels a deep stupor steals over him, as over the man who bleeds to death, for conscience is the wound, and there's not to staunch it. So after sore wrestlings with his birth, Jonah's prodigy of ponderous misery drags him drowning down to sleep. And now the time of the tide has come, the ship casts off her cables, and from the deserted wharf, the unsheared ship of Tarshish, all careening, glides to sea. That ship, my friends, was the first of recorded smugglers. The sea rebels, he will not be. Jars are clattering overboard when the wind is shrieking and the men are yelling and every plank thunders with trampling feet right over Jonah's head. In all this raging tumult, Jonah sleeps his hideous sleep. He sees no black sky and raging sea, feels not the reeling timbers, and little hears he or heeds he the far rush of the mighty whale, which even now with open mouth is cleaving the seas after him. Aye, shipmates, Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, a berth in the cabin as I have taken it, and was fast asleep. But the frightened master comes to him and shrieks in his dead ear, "What meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise!" Startled from his lethargy with that direful cry, Jonah staggers to his feet and stumbles to the deck, grasps a shroud to look out upon the sea. But at that moment he is sprung upon by a panther billow leaping over the bulwarks. Wave after wave thus leaps into the ship, and finding no speedy vent, runs roaring fore and aft till the mariners come nigh to drowning while yet afloat. And ever as the white moon shows her affrighted face from the steep guiles of the blackness overhead, aghast Jonah sees the rearing bowsprit pointing high upward, but soon beat downward again to the tormented deep. The god fugitive is now too plainly known. The sailors mark him, more and more certain grow their suspicions of him, and at last fully to test the truth by referring great tempest was upon them. The lot is Jonah's that discovered, and then how furiously they mob him with their questions. What is thine occupation? Whence comest thou? Thy country? What people? But mark now, my shipmates, the behavior of poor Jonah. The eager mariners but ask him who he is and where from, whereas they not only answer to a question not put by them, but the unsolicited answer is forced from Jonah by the hard hand of God that is upon him. God of the Lord God, then full confession, whereupon the merciful. For when Jonah, not yet supplicating God for mercy, since he but too well knew the darkness of his deserts, wretched Jonah cries out to them to take him and cast him forth into the sea, for he knew that for his sake this great tempest was upon them, they mercifully turned from him and seek by other means to save the ship. But all in vain, the indignant gale howls louder, and then with one hand raised invokingly to God, then with the other they not unreluctantly lay hold of Jonah. And now behold, Jonah taken up as an anchor and dropped into the sea, when instantly an smooth water behind. He goes down to the whirling heart of such a masterless commotion that he scarce heeds the moment when he drops seething into the yawning jaws awaiting him, and the whale shoots to all his ivory teeth like so many white bolts upon his prison. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord out of the fish's belly. But observe his prayer and learn a weighty lesson. For sinful as he is, Jonah does not weep and wail for direct deliverance. He feels that his dreadful punishment is just, though I don't know what he's done. As to God, contenting himself with this, that spite of all his pains and pangs, he will still look towards his holy temple. And here, shipmates, is true and faithful repentance, not clamorous for pardon, but grateful for punishment. And now pleasing to God was this conduct, and Jonah is shown in the eventual deliverance of him from the sea and the whale. Shipmates, I do not place Jonah before you to be copied for his sin, but I do place him before you as a model of repentance. Sin not, but if you do, take heed to repent of it like Jonah. Shrieking, slanting storm without seemed to add new power to the preacher, who, when describing Jonah's sea storm, seemed tossed by a storm himself, and his deep chest heaved as with a groundswell. His tossed arms seemed to the warring elements at work, and the thunders that rolled away from his swarthy brow and the light leaping from his eye made all his simple hearers look on him with a quick fear that was strange to them. There now came a lull in his look as he silently turned over towards the people, and bowing his head lowly with an aspect of the deepest manliest humility, he spake these words. Shipmates, God has laid but one hand upon you, both his hands press upon me. I have read ye, but by what murky light may be mine the lesson that Jonah teaches to all his sinners, and therefore to ye, and still more to me, for I am a greater sinner than ye. And now how gladly would I come down from this masthead and sit on the hatches there where you sit, and listen as you listen, while one of you reads me that other and more awful lesson which Jonah teaches to me as a pilot of the living God. How being an anointed pilot, prophet, or speaker of true things, and bidden by the Lord to sound those and welcome truths in the ears of a wicked Nineveh, Nineveh. If it wasn't for the wait, no, that's missing an A. Never mind. Nineveh. Jonah, appalled at the hostility he should raise, fled from his mission and sought to escape his duty and his God by taking ship at Joppa. But God is everywhere. Tarshish he never reached. As we have seen, God came upon him in the whale and swallowed him down to living gulfs of doom, and with swift slantings tore him along into the midst of the seas, where the eddying depths sucked him 10,000 fathoms down, and the weeds were wrapped about his head, and the watery world of woe bowed before him. Yet even then, beyond the reach of any plummet, out of the belly of hell, when the whale grounded upon the ocean's utmost bones, even then God heard the engulfed repenting prophet when he cried. Then God spake unto the fish, and from the shuddering cold and blackness of the sea, the whale came breaching up towards the warm and pleasant sun, and all the delights of air and earth, and vomited Jonah upon the dry land. When the word of the Lord came a second time, and Jonah, bruised and beaten, his ears like two seashells by the seashore, still multitudinously murmuring of the ocean, Jonah did the Almighty's bid. Was it? This, shipmates, is that other reason, and woe to that pilot of the living God who slights it. Woe to him whom this world charms from gospel duty. Woe to him who seeks to pour oil upon the waters when God has brewed them into a gale. Woe to him who seeks to please rather than to appeal. Woe to him whose good name is more to him than goodness. Woe to him who in this world courts not dishonor. Woe to him who would be not true, even though to be false were salvation. Yeah, woe to him who, as the great Pilot Paul has it, while preaching to others, is himself a castaway. He dropped and fell from himself for a moment, then lifting his face to them again, showed a deep joy in his eyes as he cried out with a heavenly enthusiasm. But oh, shipmates, on the starboard hand of every woe, there is a sure delight, and higher the top of that delight than the bottom of the woe is deep. It is not the main truck higher than the Kels.
Let me know if you'd like.
What?
I can invite you in.
Is not the main truck higher than the Kelson is low?
Thank you so much, man. I appreciate that.
What is a Kelson?
I'm putting all these subs when I get the things. It's going right back.
Delight is to him a far, far upward and inward delight, who against the proud gods and commodores of this earth ever stand forth his own inexorable self. INEXORABLE. Inexorable. Delight is to him whose ship of this base, treacherous world has gone and destroys all sin, though he pluck it out from under his robes of senators and judges. Delight, top gallant delight, is to him who acknowledges no law or lord, but the Lord his God, and is only a patriot to heaven. Delight is to him whom all the waves of the billows of the seas of the boisterous mob can never shake from this sure keel of the ages. And eternal delight and deliciousness will be his who, coming to lay him down, can say with his final breath, O Father, chiefly known to me by thy rod, mortal or immortal, here I die. I have striven to be thine more than to be this world's or mine own. Yet this is nothing. I leave eternity to thee. For what is man that he should live out the lifetime of his God? He said no more, but slowly waving a benediction, covered his face with his hands, and so remained kneeling till all the people had departed and he was left alone in the place. While that is the end of the which I was not expecting.
I think I have almost exactly what you have. Or 1.0.
All right, so I hope everything's being picked up by this mic all right. We have a thing right here. I wonder. Well, I can see that the microphone seems to be picking up my voice, so I'm going to assume that it is perfectly fine, and we're going to be reading more of Moby Dick today. A phone call might interrupt, and then I'll cut it short, but these next few chapters seem to be pretty short, so let's just get right into it. Chapter 10, A Bosom Friend. Returning to the Spouter Inn from the chapel, I found Queequeg there quite alone, he having left the chapel before the benediction some time. He was sitting on a bench before the fire, with his feet on the stove hearth, and in one hand was holding close up to his face that little idol of his, peering hard into its face and with a jackknife gently whittling away at its nose, meanwhile humming to himself in his heathenish way. But being now interrupted, he put up the image, and pretty soon, going to the table, took up a large book there, and placing it on his lap, began to count the pages with deliberate regularity. At every fifth 15th page, as I fancied, stopping a moment, looking vacantly around him, and giving utterance to a long-drawn, gurgling whistle of astonishment. He would then begin again in the next 50, seeming to commence at number 1 each time, as though he could not count more than 50, and it was only by such a large number of 50s being found together that his astonishment at the multitude of the pages was excited. With much interest I sat watching him, savage though he was, and hideously marred about the face, at least to my taste. His countenance yet had a something in it which was by no means disagreeable. You cannot hide the soul. Through all his unearthly tattooings, I thought I saw the traces of a simple, honest heart, and in his large, deep eyes, fiery, black, and bold, there seemed tokens of a spirit that would dare 1,000 devils. And besides all this, there was a certain lofty bearing about the pagan, which even his uncouthness could not altogether maim. He looked like a man who had never cringed and never had a creditor. Whether it was, too, that his head being shaved, his forearm was drawn out in freer and brighter relief, and looked more expansive than it otherwise would. This I will not venture to decide, but certain it was his head was phrenologically an excellent one. It may seem ridiculous, but it reminded me of General Washington's head as seen in the popular bursts of him. It had the same long, regularly graded, retreating slope from above the brows, which were likewise very projecting, like two long promontories, thickly wooded on top. Queequeg was George Washington cannibalistically developed. I don't know what that means. Oh well. Whilst I was thus closely scanning him, half pretending meanwhile to be looking out at the storm from the casement, he never heeded my presence, never troubled himself with so much of a single glance, but appeared wholly occupied with counting the pages of the marvelous book. Considering how sociably we had been sleeping together the night previous, and especially considering the affectionate arm I had found thrown over me upon waking in the morning, I thought this indifference of his very strange. But savages are strange beings. At times you do not know exactly how to take them. At first... Is there a way to pause this? I don't know what that name is.
Just to find out that they lift the tariff on the vehicle, that because it's over 15 years old, you can have it in the country and it's no longer an issue. And I was so livid with,
yeah, it seemed to have been not the phone call I wanted. And I don't know. We're going back to this. At first, they're overawing. Their calm self-collectedness of simplicity seems Socratic wisdom. I had noticed also that Queequeg never consorted at all, but very little with the other seamen in the inn. He made no advances whatever, appeared to have no desire to enlarge his circle of acquaintances. All this struck me as mighty singular, yet upon second thoughts there was something almost sublime in it. Here was a man some 20,000 miles from home, by the way of Cape Horn, that is, which was the only way he could get there, thrown among people as strange as him, as though he were in the planet Jupiter. Yet he seemed entirely at his ease, preserving the utmost serenity, content with his own companionship, always equal to himself. Surely this was a touch of fine philosophy, though I doubt he had ever heard that there was such a thing as that. But perhaps to be true philosophers, we mortals should not be conscious of so living or so striving. So soon as I hear that such or such a man gives himself out for a philosopher, I conclude that, like the dyspeptic old woman, he must have broken his digester. As I sat there in the now lonely room, the fire burning low in that mild stage when, after its first intensity has warmed the air, it then only glows to be looked at the evening shades and phantoms gathering round the casements and peering in upon us silent, solitary twain, the storm booming without in solemn swells, I began to be sensible of strange feelings. I felt a melting in me. No more my splintered heart and maddened hand were turned against the wolfish world. This soothing savage had redeemed it. There he sat, is very indifferent, speaking a nature in which there lurked no civilized hypocrisies and bland deceits. Wild he was, a very sight of sights to see, yet I began to feel myself mysteriously drawn towards him. And those same things that would have repelled most others, they were the very magnets that thus drew me. I'll try a pagan friend, thought I, since Christian kindness has proved but hollow courtesy. I drew my bench near him and made some friendly signs and hints, doing my best to talk with him meanwhile. At first he little noticed these advances, but presently, upon my referring to his last night's hospitalities, he made out to ask me whether we were again to be bedfellows. I told him yes, whereat I thought he looked pleased, perhaps a little complimented.
I don't pick these high top end.
I'm sorry, it's just that Moby Dick right now reads like it's a slow burn romance, despite the racism. We then turned over the book together, and I endeavored to explain to him the purpose of the printing and the meaning of the few pictures that were in it. Thus I soon engaged his interest, and from that we went to jabbering the best we could about the various outer sights to be seen in this famous town. Soon I proposed a social smoke, and producing his pouch and tomahawk, he quietly offered me a puff. And then we sat exchanging puffs from that wild pipe of his, and keeping it regularly passing between us. If there yet lurked any ice of indifference towards me in the pagan's breast, this pleasant, genial smoke we had soon thawed it out and left us cronies. He seemed to take to me quite as naturally and unbiddenly as I to him, and when our smoke was over, he pressed his forehead against mine, clasped me around the waist, and said that henceforth we were married, meaning, in his country's phrase, that we were bosom friends. He would gladly die for me, if need should be. In a countryman, the sudden flame of friendship would have seemed far too premature, a thing to be much distrusted, but in a simple savage, these old rules would not apply. It sounds... It's like he's basically no homoing it. After supper and another social chat and smoke, we went to our room together. He made me a present of his embalmed head, took out his enormous tobacco wallet, and groping under the tobacco, drew out some $30 in silver, then spreading them on the table and mechanically dividing them into two equal portions, pushed one of them towards me and said it was mine. I was going to remonstrate, but he silenced me by pouring them into his trouser pockets. I let them stay. He then went about his evening prayers, took out his idol, and removed the paper fireboard. By certain signs and symptoms, I thought he seemed anxious for me to join him, but well knowing what was to follow, I deliberated a moment whether, in case he invited me, I would comply or otherwise. I was a good Christian, born and bred in the bosom of the infallible Presbyterian Church. How then could I unite with this wild idolater in worshipping his piece of wood? But what is worship, thought I? Do you suppose now, Ishmael, that the magnanimous God of heaven and earth, pagans and all included, can possibly be jealous of an insignificant bit of black wood? Impossible! But what is worship? To do the will of God, that is worship. And what is the will of God? To do to my fellow man what I would have my fellow man do to me? That is the will of God. Now, Queequeg is my fellow man, and what do I wish that this Queequeg would do to me? Why, unite with me in my particular Presbyterian form of worship. Consequently, I must then unite with him in his, ergo I must turn idolater. So I kindled the shavings, helped prop up the innocent little idol, offered him burnt biscuit with Queequeg, salamed before him twice or thrice, kissed his nose, and that done, we undressed and went to bed, at peace with our own consciences, and all the world. But we did not go to sleep without some little chat. How it is, I know not, but there is no place like a bed for confidential disclosures between friends. Man and wife, they say, they're open the very bottom of their souls to each other, and some old couples often lie and chat over old times till nearly morning. Thus then, in our heart's honeymoon, lay I and Queequeg, a cozy, loving pair. It's cute, even if Ishmael's a racist. Okay. Chapter 11, Nightgown. We had lain thus in bed, chatting and napping at short intervals, and Queequeg now and then affectionately throwing his brown tattooed legs over mine, and then drawing them back, so entirely sociable and free and easy were we, when at last, by reason of our confabulations, what little nappishness remained in us altogether departed, and we felt like getting up again, though daybreak was yet some way down the feature. Yes, we became very wakeful, so much so that our recumbent position began to grow wearisome, and by little and little we found ourselves sitting up, the clothes well tucked around us, leaning against the headboard with our 4 knees drawn up close together, and our 2 noses bending over them as if our knee pans were warming pans. We felt very nice and snug, the more so since it was so chilly out of doors, indeed out of bedclothes too, seeing that there was no fire in the room. And more so, I say, because truly to enjoy bodily warmth, some small part of you must be cold, for there is no quality in this world that is not what is merely by contrast. Nothing exists in itself. If you flatter yourself that you are all over comfortable, and have been for so a long time, then you cannot be said to be comfortable anymore. But if, like Queequeg and me in the bed, the tip of your nose or the crown of your head be slightly chilled, why then indeed in general consciousness you feel most delightfully and unmistakably warm. For this reason a sleeping apartment should never be furnished with a fire, which is one of the luxurious discomforts of the rich. For the height of this sort of deliciousness is to have nothing but the blanket between you and your snugness and the cold of the outer air. Then where you lie like one warm spark in the heart of the Arctic crystal. We had been sitting in this crouching manner for some time, when all at once I thought I would open my eyes, for when between sheets, whether by day or by night, and whether by asleep or awake, I have a way of always keeping my eyes shut in order the more to concentrate the snugness of being in bed. Because no man can ever feel his own identity aright except his eyes be closed, as if darkness were indeed the proper element of our essences, though light be more congenial to our clay part. Upon opening my eyes and then coming out of my own pleasant and self-created darkness into the imposed and coarse outer gloom of the unilluminated 12 o'clock at night, I experienced a disagreeable revulsion. Nor did I at all object to the hint from Queequeg that perhaps it was best to strike a light, seeing that we were so wide awake, and besides, he felt a strong desire to have a few puffs from his tomahawk. Be it said that though I had felt such a strong repugnance to his smoking in the bed the night before, yet see how elastic our stiff prejudices grow when love once comes to bend them. For now I liked nothing better than to have Queequeg smoking by me, even in bed, because he seemed to be full of such serene household joy then. I no more felt unduly concerned for the landlord's policy of insurance. I was only alive to the condensed confidential comfortableness of sharing a pipe and a blanket with a real friend. With our shaggy jackets drawn about our shoulders, we now passed the tomahawk from one to the other, till there grew over us a blue hanging tester of smoke, illuminated by the flame of the new lit lamp. Whether it was that this undulating tester rolled the savage away to far distant scenes, I know not, but he spoke of his native island, and eager to hear his history, I begged him to go on and tell it. He gladly complied. Though at the time I but ill comprehended not a few of his words, yet subsequent disclosures, when I had become more familiar with his broken phraseology, now enable me to present the whole story such as it may prove in the mere skeleton I give. Chapter 12. Biographical. Queequeg was a native of Kokovoko, an island far away to the west and south. It is not down in any map, true places never are. When a new hatched savage running wild about his native woodlands in a grass clout, followed by the nibbling goats as if he were a green sapling, even then in Queequeg's ambitious soul lurked a strong desire to see something more of Christendom than a specimen whaler or two. His father was a high chief, a king, his uncle a high priest, and on the maternal side he boasts aunts who were the wives of unconquerable warriors. There was excellent blood in his veins, royal stuff, though sadly vitiated, I fear, by the cannibal propensity he nourished in his untutored youth. A Sag Harbor ship visited his father's bay, and Queequeg sought a passage to Christian lands. There's an asterisk by Sag Harbor, and it says it's an important whaling port on Long Island, New York. But the ship, having her full complement of seamen, spurned his suit, and not all the king his father's influence could prevail. But Queequeg vowed a vow. Alone in his canoe, he paddled off to a distant strait, where he knew the ship must pass through when she quitted the land. On one side was a coral reef, on the other a low tongue of land covered with mangrove thickets that grew out into the water. Hiding his canoe still afloat among these thickets with his prow seaward, he sat down in the stern, paddle low in his hand, and when the ship was gliding by, like a flash he darted out, gained her side, with one backward dash of his foot capsized, and sank his canoe, climbed up the chains, and throwing himself at full length upon the deck, grappled a ring bolt there, and swore not to let go, though hacked in pieces. In vain the captain threatened to throw him overboard, suspended a cutlass over his naked wrist. Queequeg was the son of a king, and Queequeg budged not. Struck by his desperate dauntlessness and his wild desire to visit Christendom, the captain at last relented and told him he might make himself at home. But this fine young savage, the sea prince of Wales, never saw the captain's cabin. They put him down among the sailors and made a whaleman of him. But like Sir Peter, content to toil in the shipyards of foreign cities, Queequeg disdained no seeming ignominy, if thereby he might happily gain the power of enlightening his untutored countrymen. For at bottom, so he told me, he was actuated by a profound desire to learn among the Christians the arts whereby to make his people still happier than they were, and more than that, still better than they were. But alas, the practices of whalemen soon convinced him that even Christians could be both miserable and wicked, infinitely so than all of his father's heathens. Arrived at last in Old Sag Harbor and seeing what the sailors did there, and then going on to Nantucket and seeing how they spent their wages in that place also, poor Queequeg gave it up for lost. Thought he, it's a wicked world in all meridians, I'll die a pagan. And thus an old idolater at heart, he yet lived among these Christians, wore their clothes, and tried to talk their gibberish, hence the queer ways about him, though now some time from home. By hints I asked him whether he did not propose going back and having a coronation, since he might now consider his father dead and gone, he being very old and feeble at the last accounts. He answered no, not yet, and added that he was fearful Christianity, or rather Christians, had unfitted him for ascending the pure and undefiled throne of 30 pagan kings before him. But by and by he said he would return as soon as he felt himself baptized again. For the knots, however, he proposed to sail about and sow his wild oats in the four oceans. Hi, Mom. Yeah, I'm just doing a little reading recording for fun. Okay. Okay. They had made a harpooner of him, and that barbed iron was in lieu of a scepter now. I asked him what might be his immediate purpose touching his future movements. He answered to go to sea again in his old vocation. Upon this, I told him that whaling was my own design and informed him of my intentions to sail out of Nantucket as being the most promising port of an adventurous whaleman to embark from. He at once resolved to accompany me to that island, ship aboard the same vessel, get into the same watch, the same boat, the same mess with me, in short, to share my every hap. With both my hands in his, boldly dip into the potluck both worlds. To all this I joyously assented, for besides the affection I now felt for Queequeg, he was an experienced harpooner, and as such could not fail to be of great usefulness to one who, like me, was wholly ignorant of the mysteries of whaling, though well acquainted with the sea, as known to merchant seamen. His story being ended with his pipe's last dying puff, Queequeg embraced me, pressed his forehead against mine, and blowing out the light, we rolled over from each other this way and that, and very soon we were sleeping. And that is going to have to be where I stop for today. Bye-bye.
Good round, man. See, that's the thing about La Blanca, like, there's obviously, like, a bunch of other different combos that I could do with Blanca. But because...
Hi YouTube, and welcome to another episode of Pocky for Thought. Here's hoping that
Alright, so I hope everything's getting picked up by this Michael.
And it was just really weak. So I found that sticking to like minimum amount of hits, I maximize my damage for the character. That's kind of helped propel me forward. Because in the beginning I was using a bunch of other different combos and I was just noticing like it wasn't helping me.
Before you pray, take a moment to get excited. You are about to talk to someone who loves you.
Welcome to a fireside reading of Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Chapter 13. Wheelbarrow. Next morning, Monday, after disposing of the embalmed head to a barber for a block, I settled my own and my comrade's bill, using, however, my comrade's money. The grinning landlord, as well as the boarders, seemed amazingly tickled at the sudden friendship which had sprung up between me and Queequeg, especially as Peter Coffin's cock and bull stories about him had previously so much alarmed me concerning the very person whom I now companied with. We borrowed a wheelbarrow, and embarking our things, including my own poor carpet bag and Queequeg's canvas sack and hammock, away we went to the Moss, the little Nantucket packet schooner moored at the wharf. As we were going along, the people stared. Not at Queequeg so much, for they were used to seeing cannibals like him in the streets, but at seeing him and me upon such confidential terms. But we heeded them not, going along wheeling the barrow by turns, and Queequeg now and then stopping to adjust the sheath on his harpoon barbs. I asked him why he carried such a troublesome thing with him ashore, and whether all whaling ships did not find their own harpoons. To this in substance he replied that though what I hinted was true enough, yet he had a particular affection for his own harpoon, because it was of assured stuff, well tried in many a mortal combat, and deeply intimate with the hearts of whales. In short, like many inland reapers and mowers who go into the farmers' meadows armed with their own scythes, though in no ways obliged to furnish them, even so, Queequeg, for his own private reasons, preferred his own harpoon. Shifting the barrow from my hand to his, he told me a funny story about the first wheelbarrow he had ever seen. It was in Sag Harbor. The owners of his ship, it seems, had lent him one in which to carry his heavy chest to his boarding house. Not to seem ignorant about the thing, though in truth he was entirely so, concerning the precise way in which to manage the barrow, Queequeg puts his chest upon it, lashes it fast, and then shoulders the barrow and marches up the wharf. "Why," said I, "Queequeg, you might have known better than that, one would think. Didn't the people laugh?" Upon this, he told me another story. The people of his island of Rokovoko, it seems, at their wedding feasts, expressed the fragrant water of young coconuts into a large, stained calabash like a punch bowl. And this punch bowl always forms the great central ornament on the braided mat where the feast is held. Now, a certain grand merchant ship once touched at Rokovoko, and its commander, from all accounts a very stately, punctilious gentleman, at least for a sea captain, this commander was invited to the wedding feast of Queequeg's sister, a pretty young princess, just turned 10. Well, when all the wedding guests were assembled at the bride's bamboo cottage, this captain marches in and, being assigned the post of honor, placed himself over against the punch bowl, and between the high priest and his majesty the king, Queequeg's father. Grace being said, for those people have their grace as well as we, though Queequeg told me that, unlike us, who at such times look downwards to our platters, they, on the contrary, copying the ducks, glanced upwards to the great giver of all feasts. Grace, I say, being said, the high priest opens the banquet by the immemorial ceremony of the island, that is, dipping his consecrated and consecrating fingers into the bowl before the blessed beverage circulates. Seeing himself placed next to the priest and noting the ceremony and thinking himself, being captain of a ship, as having plain precedence over a mere island king, especially in the king's own house, the captain coolly proceeds to wash his hands in the punch bowl, taking it, I suppose, for a huge finger glass. Now, said Queequeg, what you think now? Didn't our people laugh? At last, our passage paid and luggage safe, we stood on board the schooner. Hoisting sail, it glided down the Acushnet River. On one side, New Bedford rose in terraces of streets, their ice-covered trees all glittering in the clear, cold air. Huge hills and mountains of casks on casks were piled upon her wharves, and side by side, the world-wandering whale ships lay silent and safely moored at last, while from others came a sound of carpenters and coopers, with blended noises of fires and forges to melt the pitch, all betokening that new cruises were on the start. That one most perilous and long voyage ended, only begins a second, and a second ended only begins a third, and so on forever and for aye. Such is the endlessness, yea, the intolerableness of all earthly effort. Gaining the more open the water, the bracing breeze waxed fresh. The little moss tossed the quick foam from her bows as a young colt his snortings. How I snuffed that Tartar air! How I spurned that turnpike earth! That common highway, all over dented with the marks of slavish heels and hoofs, and turned me to admire the magnanimity of the sea which will permit no records. At the same foam fountain, Queequeg seemed to drink and reel with me. His dusky nostrils swelled apart. He showed his filed and pointed teeth. On we flew, and our offing gained. The moss did homage to the blast, ducked and dived her bows as a slave before the Sultan. Sideways leaning, we sideways darted, every rope yarn tingling like a wire, the two tall masts buckling like Indian canes in land tornadoes. So full of this reeling scene were we, as we stood by the plunging bowsprit, that for some time we did not notice the jeering glances of the passengers, a lubber-like assembly who marveled that two fellow beings should be so companionable, as though a white man were anything more dignified than a whitewashed Negro. But there were some boobies and bumpkins there who, by their intense greenness, must have come from the heart and center of all verdure. Queequeg caught one of these young saplings, mimicking him behind his back. I thought the bumpkin's hour of doom was come. Dropping his harpoon, the brawny savage caught him in his arms, and by an almost miraculous dexterity and strength, sent him high up bodily into the air. Then, slightly tapping his stern in mid-somerset, the fellow landed with bursting lungs upon his feet, while Queequeg, turning his back upon him, lighted his tomahawk pipe and passed it to me for a puff. "Captain! Captain!" yelled the bumpkin, running towards the officer. "Captain! Captain! Here's the devil!" "Hello, you, sir!" cried the captain, a gaunt rib of a sea, stalking up to Queequeg. "What in thunder do you mean by that? Don't you know you might have killed that chap?" "What him say?" said Queequeg, as he mildly turned to me. "He say," said I, "that you came near Killy, that man there," pointing to the still shivering greenhorn. "Killy!" cried Queequeg, twisting his tattooed face into an unearthly expression of disdain. "Ah, Him very small fishy. Quick no killy so smally fishy. Quick killy big whale. Look, you, roared the captain. I killy you, you cannibal, if you try any more of your tricks aboard here. So mind your eye. But it so happened, just then, that it was high time for the captain to mind his own eye. The prodigious strain upon the mainsail had parted the weather sheet, and the tremendous boom was now flying from side to side, completely sweeping the entire part of the deck. The poor fellow whom Queequeg had handled so roughly was swept overboard. All hands were in a panic, and to attempt snatching at the boom to stay it seemed madness. It flew from right to left and back again, almost in one ticking of a watch, and every instant seemed on the point of snapping into splinters. Nothing was done, and nothing seemed capable of being done. Those on deck rushed towards the bows and stood eyeing the boom as if it were the lower jaw of an exasperated whale. In the midst of this consternation, Queequeg dropped deftly to his knees, and crawling under the path of the boom, whipped hold of a rope, secured one end to the bulwarks, and then, flinging the other like a lasso, caught it around the boom as it swept over his head. And at the next jerk, the spar was that way trapped, and all was safe. The schooner was run into the wind, and while the hands were clearing away the stern boat, Queequeg, stripped to the waist, darted from the side with a long, living arc of a leap. For 3 minutes or more, he was seen swimming like a dog, throwing his long arms straight out before him, and by turns revealing his brawny shoulders through the freezing foam. I looked at the grand and glorious fellow, but saw no one to be saved. The greenhorn had gone down. Shooting himself perpendicularly from the waist, Queequeg now took an instant's glance around him, and seeming to see just how matters were, dived down and disappeared. A few minutes more, and he rose again, one arm still striking out, and with the other dragging a lifeless form. The boat soon picked them up. The poor bumpkin was restored. All hands voted Queequeg a noble trump, and captain begged his pardon. From that hour, I clove to Queequeg like a barnacle, yea, till poor Queequeg took his last long dive. Was there ever such unconsciousness? He did not seem to think that he at all deserved a medal from the humane and magnanimous societies. He only asked for water, fresh water, something to wipe the brine off. That done, he put on dry clothes, lighted his pipe, and leaning against the bulwarks and mildly eyeing those around him, seemed to be saying to himself, "It's a mutual joint stock world in all meridians. We cannibals must help these Christians."
My name is Reagan, and I'm going to be reading from Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Moby-Dick. Chapter 1. New Means. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off. Then I count it.
Good luck with the future in-laws tonight.
As soon as
Don't overthink it. Oh, no.
This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, sometime or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings towards the ocean with men. There now is your insular city of the Manhattoes, belted round by worlds with Indian miles of my coral reefs. Commerce surrounds it in her surf. Right and left, the streets take you home. Its extreme downtown is the Battery, where that noble mall is washed by waves of golden houses, which if you are as curious or out of sight of land, look at the crowds of water gazers there. Footnote, the Roman statesman Cato the Younger, 95 to 46 BC, killed himself rather than submit to Caesar. Circumambulate the city of a dreamy Sabbath afternoon. Go from Curlier's Hook to Colinti's Slip, and from hence by Whitewall Hall northward. What do you see? Those like silent sentinels all around the town stand thousands upon thousands of mortal men fixed in ocean reveries. They possibly can without falling in. And there they stand, miles of them, leagues, inlanders all. They come from lanes and alleys, streets and avenues, north, east, south, and west. Yet here they all unite. Tell me, does the magnetic virtue